What if there was a unit so feared that even the Hells Angels themselves whisper its name? They don't answer to chapters. They don't recognize borders. Their only loyalty is to blood and silence. And to join them, you must first kill. Hidden behind the chaos of 66 countries and nearly 6,000 members lies a Shadow Brotherhood 1 that operates like an invisible military inside a motorcycle empire. This isn't about rebellion anymore. This is organized fear. This is the Nomads. The elite within the elite. Most people think they understand the Hells Angels' loud engines, leather jackets, brotherhood, and rebellion. But what most of the world never sees is the hierarchy within the chaos. Deep inside this sprawling network of 592 chapters across 66 countries lies a secret division, a unit so exclusive, so ruthless, that even longtime angels refer to them with caution. They are known only by one name: Nomads. Unlike every other Hells Angels chapter that claims territory, California, Toronto, Sydney Nomads belong nowhere. Their bottom rocker doesn't show a place, it shows a single word: Nomads. That single word means something profound in the outlaw world. It means you answer to no local president, no city boss, no border, and often not even to national authority. You answer only to the highest power in the Angels' global command. In the traditional biker hierarchy, a full patch member's world is defined by boundaries, streets, cities, and regional politics. But the Nomads live outside that map. They are a roaming strike force, authorized to cross into any territory without permission. Where others see lines, they see open roads. If a problem arises that a local chapter can't handle or won't handle, it's the Nomads who are sent to resolve it. Quietly, permanently. Law enforcement agencies across the world have documented how the Nomads function like a Black Ops wing of the Angels. In Australia, they've been called the Club's Special Forces. In Canada, police labeled them the Commandos of Organized Crime. Dutch prosecutors, after years of infiltration attempts, concluded the Nomads exist to execute what other chapters can't officially endorse: murders, enforcement, and cross-border trafficking. Inside the organization, the Nomads are not simply respected, they are feared. Regular members might boast about loyalty, tattoos, or biker codes, but the Nomads' power is built on something far more tangible: their ability to kill without hesitation and to vanish without consequence. It's not uncommon for even senior Angels to step aside when a Nomad walks into the room. Their word outweighs titles, their patch heavier than rank. And then there's the recruitment. To join a local chapter, you ride, prospect, prove loyalty. To join the Nomads, you must prove something else: violence without hesitation. The process filters out the untested and the fearful. Every member must have history, not just of crime, but of control, the kind of cold composure it takes to pull a trigger and not flinch. Birth of the Quebec Nomads, the godfather of fear.
Angels.
The police finally have a secret weapon. A super spy inside the Hells Angels.
June 24th, 1995. Montreal was already burning under the weight of the Quebec biker war bombings, shootings, and executions, turning city streets into front lines. But that day marked something far darker than turf warfare. It marked the creation of a weaponized chapter that would redefine outlaw power in Canada. Maurice Mom Boucher, the most feared figure to ever wear the Death Head patch, founded the Hells Angels Nomads Quebec chapter unit with no borders, no mercy, and one rule above all: kill or be forgotten. Boucher's vision wasn't about rebellion or identity, it was about consolidation. He realized that traditional biker hierarchies, tied to cities and territories, created limitations. Local chapters had presidents, politics, and ego battles. He wanted something different: a centralized strike unit that could act instantly, answer only to him, and move across Canada like a ghost army. The Nomads were born not as bikers, but as operatives. Every detail of the chapter's creation was calculated. Prospective members weren't chosen for loyalty, they were chosen for capability. Court documents from Operation Springtime, the massive 2001 police sweep, later revealed that to even be considered for Quebec's Nomads, one had to commit murder, not just be willing, not just discuss it. It had to be done, documented, proven. That requirement wasn't sadism, it was strategy. No undercover agent could ever fake it. By making homicide the entry price, Boucher created an impenetrable wall against law enforcement infiltration. In effect, he built the first biker chapter in history where the only qualification was blood. Within a year, the results were staggering. The Nomads became the central command of the Hells Angels operations in Canada, outranking every regional chapter. They weren't merely members, they were administrators of violence. Their duties included settling disputes, managing cocaine pipelines, and enforcing club taxation, the drug tax every dealer in Quebec had to pay to operate under Angels' control. Law enforcement would later describe Boucher's leadership style as corporate. Every member had a role. Some were killers, some were couriers, and others were coordinators. But all were loyal to one thing, the system of power Boucher had built. He called it La Table. It was a council of killers that set the price of drugs, approved murders, and coordinated logistics with the Italian mafia. Cocaine would move in from South America through Montreal's ports, distributed through biker channels, and taxed at $50,000 a kilogram. Anyone caught selling below that price simply disappeared. What separated the Quebec Nomads from every other criminal outfit was their ability to merge business and murder. They weren't chaos, they were calculation. Every hit was a boardroom decision, everybody a message. Their influence stretched from small-town dealers to international cartels. Their power reinforced by a reputation for efficiency that even the mafia acknowledged. Murder as a membership requirement, blood before brotherhood.
It goes boom, and when they blew it, they didn't give a shit.
For most outlaw bikers, membership begins with loyalty. You hang around, earn trust, prove commitment, and one day, the patch is yours. But for the Nomads, loyalty isn't measured by time or trust. It's measured in blood. To wear their patch, you must have killed. Not metaphorically, not by rumor documented, confirmed, and proven beyond doubt. Murder isn't a consequence of their world, it's the price of admission. Maurice Mom Boucher designed this system in the mid-1990s when paranoia and infiltration were tearing outlaw clubs apart. Police informants were crippling entire chapters across Canada and the United States. Undercover agents had successfully infiltrated gangs, posing as mechanics, bodyguards, even prospects. Boucher saw a weakness. If anyone could prospect, anyone could betray. His answer was ruthless simplicity. Make the initiation so extreme that no cop could ever complete it. The murder requirement didn't just protect the organization, it reshaped it. It turned recruitment into filtration. Each kill became both proof of loyalty and a criminal fingerprint the club could use as leverage forever. Once you'd killed for the Nomads, you could never truly leave. Your crime bound you to them. The blood you spilled was your lifetime contract. One of the most chilling examples came from the case of Stéphane Godas Guertin, a young biker desperate for Nomad status. On June 26, 1997, he and fellow Angel André Toots Toussaint targeted prison guard Diane Lavigne as she left work in Montreal. Riding double on a motorcycle, they pulled alongside her car and opened fire, killing her instantly. The act was senseless to the public, but to the club, it was initiation. Within days, Guertin and Toussaint were accepted as prospects half-patched, halfway human. Wiretaps later captured Toussaint calling his wife to brag, "I got my patch yesterday." She responded, "I'm so proud of you." In that single exchange lay the horror of Nomad culture murder normalized. Violence celebrated as achievement. The patch system became their resume. Each symbol on their vest documented what others would call atrocities. Police later uncovered ledgers and coded notes showing that each kill was recorded. Every member's contribution was logged, creating a black market ledger of death that doubled as insurance. Betray the club, and they wouldn't just expose your crimes, they'd replay them in court. It was a system of loyalty enforced by guilt. International expansion, Nomads worldwide. What began as a Canadian experiment in control didn't stay contained for long. By the late 1990s, the Nomads concept had crossed oceans, embedding itself into the Hells Angels network like a second bloodstream. Across Europe, Australia, and beyond, new Nomads chapters appeared, each operating with the same terrifying autonomy that made the Quebec model untouchable. They had no borders, no oversight, and no limits. The United Kingdom was among the first to see this transformation. In February 1989, the Hells Angels Nomads England chapter was officially established, marking a turning point in European outlaw culture. Their website described them as men of great character, strength, and honor. But behind the rhetoric lay something darker. Law enforcement would soon learn that this chapter's independence wasn't poetic. It was lethal. In 1997, senior English nomad Stephen Grumps Cunningham vanished after boarding a ferry to the Netherlands. Dutch investigators later discovered that he had been executed and dumped in a canal, allegedly by members of the Amsterdam Hells Angels, under contract from Cunningham's own chapter. His crime wasn't betrayal of the club itself. His death revealed an unsettling truth. Nomads were autonomous enough to arrange cross-border assassinations against their own members. Loyalty wasn't protection, it was probation. In Germany, police raids during the 2000s uncovered Nomads chapters running weapons pipelines that stretched from Eastern Europe to Scandinavia. One 2009 arrest in Potsdam, during the opening of a new Hells Angels pub, exposed a fugitive nomad wanted for arms trafficking. He'd been living openly among his brothers, protected not by secrecy, but by the simple fact that law enforcement didn't know which country's jurisdiction he belonged to. The patch nomads meant everywhere and nowhere. In the Netherlands, authorities fought a losing war against the club's presence. Investigators described their operations as borderless business. Nomads from Denmark would appear in Amsterdam one week, then vanish into Germany the next. They weren't fugitives in hiding, they were operators in motion. The structure made traditional law enforcement tactics obsolete. You couldn't raid a territory that didn't exist. Australia's Nomads took the system even further. Originally established in Sydney during the 1980s, the Australian Nomads became known as the Enforcers of Enforcers. They weren't just internal muscle, they handled international coordination, arms deals, and political corruption through Bicky networks that spanned the Pacific. Police task forces repeatedly called them untouchable. In 2012, Australian intelligence confirmed that the Nomads were actively supporting organized crime in Southeast Asia, particularly through methamphetamine distribution and weapons trade. The global spread of Nomads chapters reflected a new form of criminal evolution. These were no longer localized gangs competing for neighborhoods. They were mobile syndicates, capable of crossing borders faster than any extradition treaty could track them. Their mobility meant resilience. When one country cracked down, another chapter absorbed operations seamlessly. Each Nomads chapter operated like a franchise of fear, independent, profitable, and expendable. They shared intelligence across encrypted channels, coordinated enforcement hits, and managed logistics for everything from narcotics to human trafficking. And while each country's laws differed, their loyalty didn't. The patch was the passport. Drug empires and Murder Inc., the business of terror.
Like that, they warned him, he didn't accept the warnings. In the end, they had him killed.
By the late 1990s, the Quebec Nomads had evolved beyond violence. They had become a corporation of death. The engines, the patches, the bravado were only surface details. Beneath it all, they were running one of the most sophisticated criminal economies in Canadian history. Every kilogram of cocaine, every ounce of methamphetamine, every deal struck in back alleys or luxury condos passed through their invisible system of taxation. Violence wasn't chaos anymore, it was policy. At the top sat La Table Council of Nomads, led by Maurice Mom Boucher, functioning like an underworld board of directors. Their first decree, all cocaine sold in Quebec would cost $50,000 per kilogram. No exceptions. The rule wasn't a guideline, it was law. Dealers caught underselling didn't get fined, they vanished. Law enforcement later discovered ledgers in Nomad safehouses listing dozens of names crossed out in red ink. Every one of them had sold below the price. Every one of them had been erased. This structured brutality turned the drug trade into a machine that generated millions monthly. Through strategic alliances with the Sicilian Mafia, Particularly the Rizzuto family, the nomads controlled both supply and distribution. Cocaine flowed from South America into Montreal's ports, where mafia contacts handled import logistics and biker couriers managed inland transport. Nomads provided the muscle, mafia the connections, and together they created a monopoly powerful enough to dictate street prices across the entire province. It wasn't just drugs. The nomads diversified into protection rackets, money laundering, and contract enforcement. Businesses paid for security they didn't need because the alternative was destruction. Bar owners, strip clubs, and even construction companies fell under their umbrella. Every dollar that entered the underground economy passed through nomads' hands. For the first time in Canadian criminal history, one chapter had successfully centralized organized crime under a single violent management structure. But empires built on fear are empires built on paranoia. The system devoured its own. When internal disputes over profits arose, executions followed. One of the most infamous victims was Louis Melu Roy, president of the Trois-Rivières Hells Angels chapter and a founding member of the Nomads. After questioning Boucher's pricing system, Roy was invited to a 5th anniversary party for the chapter. He never came home. His body was never found. Police later confirmed he had been murdered on direct orders from La Table. In the world of the Nomads, disagreement was treason. Their efficiency stunned law enforcement. The Nomads operated like a multinational conglomerate, complete with accountants, couriers, and enforcers. Wiretaps revealed coded conversations about contracts and deliveries, terms that referred as often referred to human lives as to drugs. Investigators began to call them Murder Inc. North Network, where violence wasn't emotional, it was transactional. Every hit had a budget. Everybody was an invoice. Between 1994 and 2002, more than 160 people died in the Quebec Biker War. Roughly half were directly linked to the Nomads' enforcement of drug discipline. Their message to rivals, police, and partners was the same: control isn't declared, it's demonstrated. Digital nomads of death, evolution in the shadows. When the engines quieted and the street wars faded, the nomads didn't die, they adapted. The 21st century turned its methods from asphalt to algorithms. What once required guns, safe houses, and coded phone calls could now be done with encryption, cryptocurrency, and a laptop. The Hells Angels nomads were no longer just riders. They were architects of a digital underworld that made geography irrelevant. Investigators in Canada and Europe began noticing a new pattern around 2015. The nomads' public visibility had dropped sharply. No flashy clubhouses, no loud rallies, no visible leaders. Yet their financial trails multiplied. Bitcoin wallets tied to known nomad associates moved hundreds of thousands of dollars across exchanges in Hong Kong, Dubai, and Cyprus. Police traced them to online dark market vendors selling weapons, synthetic opioids, and forged passports. The nomads had turned the internet into their new highway. Encrypted communication became their strongest armor. Apps like Threema, Wicker, and specially modified BlackBerry devices allowed entire chapters to communicate globally without interception. The same organizational logic that once controlled drug routes across Quebec was now being used to manage crypto wallets, smuggling routes, and contract payments in real time. Intelligence analysts described them as a decentralized digital cartel. The psychological warfare changed too. Fear was no longer spread through gunfire, it spread through silence. Rumors circulated that certain online posts criticizing the Angels were traced, and the posters disappeared. Whether true or not, the threat kept everyone quiet. Power through uncertainty had always been the nomads' greatest weapon. Even recruitment has evolved. The old murder requirement remained in spirit, but now it included digital qualifications. Candidates had to demonstrate not only criminal capability, but technical skill, encryption knowledge, access to darknet markets, or connections to cyber laundering networks. Background checks were no longer word of mouth. They were algorithmic, using secure channels and layered identities to verify trust. Law enforcement called it criminal blockchain vetting, a system almost impossible to infiltrate. Behind the myth, the real nomads refined their control. Digital banking gave them reach far beyond narcotics. They invested in shell companies, construction firms, and import businesses, filtering illicit profits into legitimate economies. Cryptocurrency anonymized it all, erasing the trail faster than police could trace it. What had started as biker extortion had evolved into a global portfolio. To law enforcement, it felt like chasing ghosts. Every time an operation targeted a suspected leader, the network shifted. New aliases appeared, messages self-deleted. Servers vanished overnight. The nomads had mastered the principle that kept them alive for decades, never exist long enough to be understood. By 2020, they were something unrecognizable. Not a gang, not a club, but a living system of organized anonymity. The roads they once ruled had become digital. The leather vests were replaced by encryption keys. And while their engines no longer echoed through the night, their presence still haunted the dark corners of the web, where loyalty is coded in binary and blood. Global crackdowns and law enforcement response, nations against ghosts. By the early 2000s, governments across the world finally began to understand what they were up against. The Hells Angels nomads weren't just a biker gang. They were a decentralized organism, a network of criminals that ignored borders, treaties, and traditional enforcement structures. Every attempt to dismantle them revealed the same truth. You can't destroy what doesn't officially exist. The first major coordinated strike came in 2001 with Operation Springtime. It was the largest criminal sweep in Canadian history, a multi-agency offensive that targeted the Hells Angels and their support clubs across Quebec. When the smoke cleared, 142 bikers were in custody, almost the entire Quebec Nomads chapter among them. Authorities celebrated it as a victory, believing they had decapitated the most violent wing of the Angels. But within months, something unnerving happened. Other chapters simply absorbed their operations. The Trois-Rivières chapter stepped in, taking over coordination duties, and membership in Quebec increased. The Nomads hadn't fallen, they had multiplied. Law enforcement began to realize they were chasing an idea rather than an organization. In Europe, the Netherlands took the most radical step. After years of investigating murder, extortion, and drug cases tied to Nomads chapters, Dutch prosecutors argued that the Hells Angels were not a club, but a criminal organization designed for violence. Their legal filings described the Nomads as the operational brain of the Angels, responsible for enforcing control through intimidation and murder. The Dutch courts agreed. In 2019, they became the first country to officially ban the Hells Angels outright. Belgium followed, criminalizing membership entirely. Police intelligence reports made it clear why. Nomads chapters were coordinating cross-border trafficking networks that stretched from Antwerp's docks to Eastern Europe's arms dealers. Even when leaders were arrested, operations continued. Emails, encrypted calls, and offshore bank accounts kept the machine running. It wasn't just organized crime, it was organized continuity. Australia's approach was different. State governments created anti-bikie task forces, deploying military-style raids on known nomads' properties and freezing assets through anti-consorting laws. Yet each crackdown revealed the same problem. For every clubhouse closed, another opened under a new front. For every seized motorcycle, another appeared under a different name. The Nomads' decentralized design made them self-healing. Technology became their greatest weapon. Police wiretaps often picked up only coded fragments, phrases like "move the table," "change the color," or "ride clean." Each phrase could mean money, drugs, or murder. Without physical jurisdiction, enforcement became symbolic. Governments could raid a house, but not a hierarchy. By the 2010s, Interpol stepped in, forming Project Sabre, an international intelligence-sharing task force dedicated to mapping the Hells Angels' global structure. The data shocked even veteran investigators. Nomads chapters weren't confined to one nation. They were actively cooperating across at least 17 countries, exchanging intelligence and financial resources like a multinational company. Their communications were encrypted, their meetings arranged in neutral zones like Dubai or the Canary Islands, and their funds routed through crypto laundering platforms. The Netherlands National Police described the challenge in a single phrase: "They don't live anywhere, so you can't evict them." The terror within, why angels fear the nomads.
Walter Stadnick might not have looked much, but the Canadian took the Hells Angels from mafia errand boys to world's toughest group after founding the Nomads.
Inside the sprawling network of the Hells Angels, power is everything earned through rank, reputation, and brutality. But even among the most hardened members, one chapter evokes silence. The Nomads. They are the Angels' secret mirror, an elite force that enforces discipline through fear. Regular chapters see them not as brothers, but as executioners with patches. And for good reason. When the Nomads arrive, it usually means someone inside the organization has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The Hells Angels are built on the motto, Angels Forever, Forever Angels. In theory, it means loyalty for life. In reality, it's a warning: once you're in, you're never out. The Nomads exist to enforce that law. They don't punish outsiders, they punish betrayal from within. Former members who defected to law enforcement have described the atmosphere they create as controlled terror. Even high-ranking presidents tread carefully when Nomads are in the room. The murder of Louis Melou Roy, a founding Nomad and president of the Trois-Rivières chapter, is the most chilling example of this internal brutality. Roy had objected to the Nomads' strict cocaine pricing system, believing it was bad for business. On June 25, 2000, he attended what was supposed to be a celebration, the 5th anniversary of the Nomads' founding. He never left alive. His body was never found. Investigators later confirmed he was executed on orders from La Table Same leadership council he helped create. In the Nomads' world, questioning authority isn't dissent, it's suicide. But the threat doesn't stop with disobedience. In 1997, across the Atlantic, English nomad Stephen Grumps Cunningham was murdered after a dispute with his own chapter. The contract wasn't handled internally. It was outsourced to the Amsterdam Hells Angels. Cunningham's death proved that Nomads' reach extended beyond geography, and that loyalty wasn't shield, it was surveillance. The system devours its own to sustain itself. To outsiders, the Hells Angels are a brotherhood. To insiders, the Nomads are a reminder of what that brotherhood costs. Members describe them as men without fear, but what that really means is they've already crossed every moral boundary. Their violence isn't a reaction, it's procedure. The Nomads maintain control not just through force, but through psychology. They study members' weaknesses, debts, and family connections. When disobedience surfaces, punishment is tailored to send a message. Sometimes it's a beating, sometimes it's disappearance, but always it's final. The fear they command is deliberate. Law enforcement wiretaps from the early 2000s captured regular Angels warning each other never to cross Nomads' business. You don't touch their money, you don't question their calls, one member said. They don't argue, they replace you. Even the Hells Angels International Board respects their power. Nomads often act as mediators in global disputes between chapters, but their involvement carries the weight of death. If they arrive at negotiate, the decision is already made. The result might be exile, or it might be execution. Either way, no one refuses. The Shadow Empire, the Hells Angels' invisible kingdom. By the time the world began to piece together what the Nomads truly were, they had already evolved beyond comprehension. Beneath the roar of Harley engines and the illusion of chaos, they had built something unprecedented. A global, decentralized criminal empire operating without borders, titles, or mercy. To the public, they were the Hells Angels' most secretive chapter. To the underworld, they were the ruling shadow. What makes the Nomads so terrifying isn't their size, it's their structure. They don't rely on hierarchy the way traditional crime families do. There's no fixed leader, no defined territory, and no permanent headquarters. Each Nomads chapter operates like a node in a neural network, autonomous, adaptive, and connected through encrypted communication. If one node is destroyed, the system reroutes. The empire survives. Law enforcement officials across Canada and Europe have called them the Ghost Syndicate, an organism that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Their strength lies in invisibility. While regular Hells Angels chapters display their colors proudly, marking their territory with patches and public runs, the Nomads thrive in the unseen. They infiltrate, they observe, they act when others can't. Former members describe them as the angels that never sleep. When tensions rise between chapters, it's the nomads who appear uninvited, their arrival signaling that the matter will be resolved, one way or another. Unlike the Mafia, whose leadership hierarchy is a matter of historical record, the nomads' command structure is deliberately fluid. Decisions are made by consensus between senior enforcers, many of whom operate under multiple identities. Their communications move through encrypted servers and secure intermediaries. No member knows all others. No operation is fully visible to anyone but the core. This compartmentalization ensures that betrayal is impossible without self-destruction. The result is terrifying efficiency. In the 2000s, as police dismantled one nomad's network in Quebec, new ones quietly emerged in Europe, in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Each carried the same operational DNA: small, violent, financially intelligent, and utterly loyal. They didn't compete with local chapters, they overruled them. Their role was no longer about territory or pride. It was about maintaining the balance of power within the world's largest outlaw brotherhood. Even the global expansion of the Hells Angels, now spanning over 66 countries, owes its stability to the nomads' unseen hand. Whenever regional wars erupted between biker gangs, from Scandinavia to the Balkans, nomad mediators appeared, enforcing peace through calculated fear. Behind the scenes, they became the Angels' international police. Assassins and diplomats rolled into one. Their financial operations are just as intricate. Shell companies in Eastern Europe launder drug profits through logistics firms and construction contracts. Offshore accounts in the Caribbean conceal the earnings of smuggling networks that link South America to Europe and Australia. The nomads aren't chasing chaos, they're managing it, turning global disorder into structured, repeatable income. What's most chilling, though, is their adaptability. Every time law enforcement declares victory, the nomads change tactics, swapping motorcycles for cargo trucks, paper trails for digital wallets. They have evolved from riders to strategists, from visible outlaws to invisible architects of crime. Blood currency, how violence became the Angels' economy. In most criminal enterprises, money is the measure of success. For the nomads, it's blood. Every dollar earned, every patch awarded, every alliance formed is paid for in violence. It's not chaos, it's currency. And within the Hells Angels' invisible hierarchy, the nomads are the mint. They decide who lives, who dies, and who gets to keep earning under their shadow. Violence for them isn't random, it's structured. The nomads treat murder the way corporations treat mergers and acquisitions, as strategic moves to maintain market dominance. When a dealer sells cocaine below nomad's set price, his death isn't revenge, it's economic enforcement. When a rival gang moves into their city, the ensuing bloodshed isn't turf war, it's cost control. Every act of brutality stabilizes profit and deters competition. By the late 1990s, law enforcement uncovered that the nomads had weaponized fear into a business tool. Boucher's Quebec Council Law Table didn't just dictate drug prices, it decided who could sell, where, and for how much. Anyone operating outside that structure faced execution. This brutal consistency built an empire worth tens of millions in annual revenue. Police wiretaps recorded nomads joking about writing invoices after shootings, a chilling euphemism for collecting payments after murders sanctioned by the club. But their economy extended beyond narcotics. Extortion, protection rackets, and money laundering formed a triad of profit streams, all backed by violence. Business owners across Montreal, Laval, and Sherbrooke paid insurance fees to avoid broken windows or worse. The nomads didn't need contracts. The fear was contract enough. If a business owner refused, his bar might burn down overnight, or he might vanish before dawn. Their alliance with organized crime families like the Rizzutos turned this violence into legitimacy within the underworld. The Mafia provided logistics and financial cover. The nomads provided enforcement. Together they created a closed-loop system of control where money and murder fed each other endlessly. One of the most revealing moments came during Operation Springtime in 2001, when prosecutors presented ledgers recovered from nomad safe houses. They weren't filled with financial figures, but but with initials, dates, and cryptic notes like paid in full or settled. Every one of those entries, investigators learned, represented a human life. The nomads didn't just account for cash, they accounted for corpses. Their economy was self-regulating. Members who killed on behalf of the club earned prestige patches like Filthy Few or Dequile, symbolic currency exchanged for loyalty and protection. The more violence one commits, the higher his rank, the greater his access to profits. In this world, morality wasn't just absent, it was inverted. Killing wasn't the cost of business, it was the business. Even when the nomads expanded internationally, the blood economy remained intact. In Europe, contracts became more professionalized, outsourced to trusted affiliates in other chapters, or even rival gangs. A hit in Germany could be ordered from Canada and executed in hours. The digital age only streamlined the process of payments in cryptocurrency, communication through encrypted channels, and instructions disguised as innocent messages. The murder requirement, no infiltration allowed.
He seemed to love it. Quebec's biker war raged for 8 years. More than 160 people were killed.
Infiltrating the Hells Angels was never easy, but infiltrating the nomads was impossible. Their existence was designed around a single cold-blooded principle. No one can join unless their hands are already stained with blood. It wasn't a myth or initiation legend, it was policy crafted with precision by Maurice "Mom" Boucher during the Quebec Biker Wars. The rule guaranteed one thing: every nomad had already committed a crime that made undercover policing suicidal. For law enforcement, it was an unsolvable paradox. Traditional infiltration relies on trust and patience building credibility over months, sometimes years. But how could any police officer, no matter how deep their cover, pass a test that required them to kill? Boucher had understood this perfectly. He didn't just create a club, he engineered a fortress. The murder requirement emerged in 1995 when Boucher officially formed the Nomads chapter in Quebec. It wasn't hidden. It was whispered through the underworld, a message meant to deter outsiders and weed out the unworthy. If you wanted the Nomads patch, you had to prove your loyalty with blood. Candidates often performed killings under supervision, ensuring the act was witnessed and verified. Once complete, their names were entered into what investigators would later describe as a ledger of death. That record doubled as insurance proof of loyalty and blackmail if needed. The logic was flawless. Murder is irreversible. It binds the killer to the organization forever because exposure means prison or execution. Every nomad, by design, was trapped inside his own crime. Loyalty wasn't just emotional, it was structural. This recruitment model also served another purpose. It created an instant hierarchy. Those willing to kill without hesitation earned power immediately. Those who hesitated never advanced. The result was a chapter made entirely of men who had already crossed the point of no return. They were unemotional, efficient, and utterly immune to guilt. The system's effectiveness was revealed during Operation Printemps 2001, Canada's largest anti-biker operation. Prosecutors discovered that every nomad arrested had direct involvement in at least one homicide. Police analysts called it the first organization with murder as a membership policy. It explained why no law enforcement agent, no matter how skilled, ever got inside. But Boucher's innovation didn't stay contained in Quebec. Intelligence reports later revealed that nomad chapters in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands adopted their own versions of the requirement, sometimes substituting murder for other acts of extreme violence, like attacking police officers or rival club leaders. The logic was the same: make entry impossible for anyone who hadn't already destroyed their legal life. Even communication between nomads followed this philosophy. Messages were coded, compartmentalized, and sometimes self-incriminating by design. If a message was intercepted, it would link only to people already beyond redemption. There was nothing to expose that the club didn't already know. To outside observers, the system looked monstrous. To the nomads, it was purity. Every member had proved beyond doubt that loyalty outweighed morality. Every handshake came from a man who had killed and could kill again. This requirement didn't just keep the police out, it kept fear in. The nomads weren't criminals who might kill, they were killers who happened to be criminals. Over time, that distinction became the essence of their legend. It's why their name carries such weight in the underworld, why even allied gangs hesitate to cross them. The nomads' greatest weapon was never their firepower, their bikes, or their numbers. It was this simple, devastating truth that one joins by pretending to be dangerous. You join by proving you already are. International expansion, nomads without borders. What began as a Canadian experiment in controlled violence quickly spread across oceans. The nomads weren't just a chapter anymore, they became a franchise of fear. A global network of Hells Angels operatives untethered from geography or governance. From Montreal to Manchester, Berlin to Sydney, the Nomads brand evolved into the elite backbone of international biker power. Wherever they appeared, violence followed and order soon after. The first European Nomads chapter was founded in England in 1989, a strategic move during a volatile period in the UK's criminal underworld. While other Angels chapters clashed with rival biker gangs and police, the English Nomads kept a low profile, but beneath that quiet surface, they were enforcing internal discipline with brutal precision. In 1997, senior Nomads member Stephen Grumps Cunningham vanished after boarding a ferry bound for the Netherlands. Dutch police later learned he'd been murdered allegedly by Amsterdam Angels. Under contract from Cunningham's own chapter, his death marked a precedent. The Nomads could reach across borders, even against their own. By the early 2000s, the model had replicated across Europe. Germany's Berlin Nomads became infamous for their ongoing territorial wars with the Bandidos and Gremium MCs. Battles fought with grenades and automatic weapons in public streets. In Denmark, the Copenhagen Nomads were instrumental in consolidating the Hells Angels' dominance during the Nordic biker wars, orchestrating hits on rivals and maintaining weapons caches that rivaled small militias. Each chapter operated independently, but followed the same unwritten constitution answer to no one: show no weakness, and enforce the club's global interests with extreme violence. Law enforcement agencies began noticing how these nomad units functioned like military detachments, not motorcycle clubs. They weren't social riders, they were operational cells. Intelligence sharing, logistics, and recruitment were all handled with the discipline of a covert agency. Each chapter contained men already wanted in other countries, protected by the Nomads' unofficial passport, fear. Their reputation alone ensured safe passage through ports and borders, where ordinary criminals would never survive scrutiny. In Australia, the arrival of the Nomads around 2007 changed the entire biker landscape. The Sydney Nomads broke away from the traditional Hells Angels structure, forming their own hybrid empire that combined outlaw biker culture with local organized crime. They moved quickly into drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and high-end extortion rackets. Police reports later confirmed that their operations extended across New South Wales, Queensland, and even into Southeast Asia, creating one of the most profitable chapters outside North America. What made the Nomads' global expansion unstoppable was adaptability. Each region's chapter tailored itself to its environment. In Europe, they exploited legal loopholes around association laws. In Australia, they infiltrated local street gangs to establish control from the bottom up. In Canada, they retained their status as the enforcers of the old guard, guarding alliances with mafia families and cartel liaisons. Every chapter shared a single ethos: mobility equals survival. The network they built had no borders, no presidents, and no weak points. Nomads in different continents could coordinate without ever meeting, using encrypted digital channels and coded language that baffled even experienced investigators. Some messages appeared to be ordinary biker talk discussions about rides, colors, or oil changes, but each carried operational meaning. To law enforcement, dismantling them became a global nightmare. Arrests in one country triggered retaliations in another. Informants disappeared. Witnesses recanted. The Nomads had become something that transcended both national and criminal boundaries. An ecosystem of loyal killers, each bound not by location, but by ideology. Their motto remained the same across languages: no territory, no borders, no mercy. The Hells Angels had always been a symbol of rebellion. But the Nomads turned rebellion into structure, structure into business, and business into an empire that spanned continents. They weren't just the Angels' most elite chapter. They were their global nervous system, pulsing through the veins of organized crime, unseen but everywhere. The government cracked down when nations fought the nomads. When governments realized what the nomads had become, the response was immediate and desperate. Conventional policing couldn't contain them. Local task forces failed. Even national agencies found themselves chasing ghosts. The nomads weren't a chapter that could be raided or a clubhouse that could be closed. They were everywhere and nowhere, men without borders, operating above jurisdiction. To fight them, nations had to rewrite their laws. The Netherlands became the first country to make a bold move. After decades of escalating biker violence, Dutch prosecutors built a case to ban the Hells Angels entirely. But their argument didn't rest on typical criminal charges. Instead, they focused on ideology, the culture of violence that defined the nomads. They presented evidence of internal awards for brutality, photos of patches like Filthy Few and Dequeel, and proof that these patches were earned through verified acts of violence. The Dutch courts concluded that the Hells Angels weren't a motorcycle club. They were a paramilitary organization. In 2019, the ban became the first of its kind. Belgium followed soon after, declaring the Hells Angels an illegal organization and criminalizing membership itself. Investigators there had uncovered cross-border coordination between nomads chapters in Antwerp, Liège, and the Netherlands, involving drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and contract killings. The evidence showed something law enforcement had long suspected. The nomads weren't just rogue bikers. They were the command layer of a transnational criminal network. In Germany, the crackdown turned violent. Police raids on nomad safe houses revealed military-grade weapons, AK-47s, grenades, and encrypted satellite phones. Yet every raid seemed to provoke new violence. Bombings targeted rival gangs, but also police vehicles and prosecutors' homes. Each act carried a signature precision, timing, and an unmistakable message. We're still here. Canada, the birthplace of the nomads' modern model, faced its own reckoning during Operation Springtime 2001. It was one of the largest police actions in Canadian history. 1,200 officers, 142 arrests, and the seizure of millions in cash, guns, and drugs. The operation effectively decapitated the Quebec nomads. Maurice Mom Boucher and nearly all senior leaders were arrested. For a moment, the government believed they had ended the nightmare, but what followed stunned even veteran investigators. Within a year, new nomads chapters emerged in Trois-Rivières, Montreal, and Halifax. Membership didn't shrink, it increased. The message was clear: dismantle one and another rises. The nomad structure made them immune to decapitation. There was no central leadership, no single point of failure. Every chapter was autonomous, yet synchronized a criminal version of the internet. To combat this, law enforcement developed new strategies. International task forces began to form joint operations between the FBI, Interpol, and Europol. These units targeted financial assets instead of members, aiming to choke off the lifeblood of the nomads' empire. Millions were seized in cryptocurrency wallets and offshore accounts. Still, it wasn't enough. For every account frozen, another appeared in a different name, in a different country. Some governments went further. Denmark introduced anti-clubhouse laws, allowing police to confiscate any property used for organized crime meetings. Australia implemented the Criminal Organisation Control Act, giving authorities the power to ban gatherings of suspected nomads and outlaw, even wearing their insignia in public. But even with global coordination, the results were mixed. The nomads adapted faster than any law enforcement model. When physical clubhouses became targets, they went digital. When members were tracked by location, they shifted to encrypted apps and ghost phones. Every government strategy exposed the same truth. Nomads weren't a gang, they were an idea. And you can't arrest an idea. What the world learned from the nomads is chilling. The most dangerous criminal organizations don't need borders, presidents, or official structures. They only need loyalty forged in violence, communication built on fear, and members willing to die before they talk. The government could ban their patches, raid their homes, and freeze their accounts. But as long as men somewhere were willing to prove their loyalty with blood, the nomads would live on quiet, patient, and waiting for the next war. The terror within, why even the Hells Angels fear the Nomads. Among the Hells Angels, there's a rule that defines their entire brotherhood. Angels forever, forever angels. It's a declaration of eternal loyalty, an unbreakable code that binds members for life. But within the Nomads, that phrase takes on a darker, deadlier meaning. Because in their world, forever often ends with a bullet. Ordinary angels live by the protection of their chapter. They drink together, fight together, and count on each other for survival. The Nomads live in a different reality. Their chapter is not a family, it's a machine. Each member is a moving part, valuable only as long as he performs. Once that value fades, he becomes expendable. And when a Nomad is no longer useful, his brothers are the ones who make him disappear. Take Louis Melu Roy, a founding member of the Quebec Nomads. By all accounts, Roy was as loyal as they came, ruthless, efficient, and respected. But when he disagreed with Maurice Monboucher about cocaine pricing and internal profits, his loyalty became irrelevant. Roy vanished after attending a Nomad's anniversary party in June 2000. His body was never found. Investigators later concluded that Roy had been executed by his own brothers. His death ordered by the same men who toasted him hours before. This kind of betrayal wasn't rare, it was doctrine. In the Nomad structure, internal discipline is absolute. Members who question authority, leak information, or even hesitate on assignments are removed permanently. The English Nomads showed the same ruthlessness when Stephen Grumps Cunningham was killed after a dispute with his chapter. His murder was outsourced to the Dutch Angels, a contract killing that proved even distance couldn't save a marked man. Inside Nomad circles, these purges serve a dual purpose. They erase weakness and reinforce fear. Every member knows he's only as safe as his obedience. There are no warnings, no second chances. Survival depends on silence, loyalty, and performance. And that's why even full-patch Hells Angels tread carefully around Nomads. Regular Angels might brawl, shoot, or intimidate, but Nomads are trained to kill efficiently. They don't posture, they don't threaten, they execute. Law enforcement sources describe them as biker assassins, operating with a professionalism more akin to military units than street gangs. Their operations are timed to the second, often carried out in public without panic or hesitation. When the Quebec Biker War reached its bloodiest phase, witnesses reported killings so precise that investigators compared them to tactical strikes. The psychological dominance of the Nomads inside the Hells Angels can't be overstated. Even high-ranking chapter presidents lower their voices when discussing them. They represent the organization's purest embodiment of violence. A reminder that in the Angels' hierarchy, power doesn't come from seniority or territory. It comes from fear. This terror extends beyond the club. Rivals know that crossing the Nomads means total annihilation. Police know that arresting one means retaliation. Informants know that betrayal is a death sentence that can reach across oceans. The Nomads' reputation does more than protect them. It paralyzes anyone who might act against them. But beneath the myth lies something more haunting. The Nomad structure ensures no one ever truly wins, not even them. The same system that makes them untouchable also consumes them from within. Each killing cements loyalty, but erases trust. Each purge strengthens discipline, but weakens brotherhood. It's an empire built on paranoia, where every handshake hides the possibility of betrayal, and yet they endure. Because in their world, survival isn't about trust. It's about control. The Nomads have become the invisible enforcers of the Hells Angels global network. The shadow operators who ensure rules are followed through terror rather than respect. Ask any angel about the Nomads, and you'll see it. The pause before they answer, the glance over the shoulder, the change in tone. It's not reverence, it's fear. Fear of the men who don't need patches to prove who they are. Fear of the brothers who kill brothers to keep the machine alive. Fear of the shadow empire that rides under one word.
With the Bandidos Motorcycle Club be disarmed. It's a case going through the Milam County Court right now, and one defense attorney says it could set a dangerous precedent.
How do you defeat an outlaw empire that thrives on fear, loyalty, and roaring engines? Not with louder guns, but with patience, pressure, and time. This story follows the Bandidos through rival wars, betrayals, and invisible enemies who never wore patches. From parking lots soaked in blood to courtrooms stacked with files, every move tightened the noose. What happens when the road disappears, the money freezes, the phones go silent, and the future stops caring? No sirens warn of the ending. Jeff Pike's Kingdom, the day Texas stopped belonging to the Bandidos.
Our Bill Barajas tells us both are now waiting on the sentencing phase.
We heard a lot about the split on the far right, it's the old patch.
These vests and their...
Jeff Pike didn't build the Bandidos' Texas reputation with speeches. He built it with rules. In his world, a patch wasn't decoration, it was a deed. You didn't simply ride through a county, host a rally, or open a clubhouse without the proper nod. There were protocols, phone calls, intermediaries, and the quiet sentence that meant everything. We're passing through your territory. That's how an outlaw empire stays stable. And that's why the challenge from the Cossacks felt like a direct strike at the crown. For years, the Cossacks were smaller, hungrier, and louder about it. They wore their colors like an argument, showing up at events where the Bandidos expected automatic deference. Whispers followed them. They refused to pay tax. They didn't ask permission. They didn't treat Texas like someone else's kingdom. In the biker world, that isn't stubbornness. It's a provocation that forces a response, because if one club gets away with it, the whole hierarchy collapses. Then came Waco, May 17, 2015. Twin Peaks was supposed to be a routine gathering, the kind of midday meetup where men in leather talk business over plates of food, pretending normal life still exists. Instead, it turned into a parking lot war. Dozens of bikes rolled in, then more. The atmosphere wasn't festive, it was loaded. Two groups circling the same space, reading every stare, every step, every hand drifting too close to a waistband. The first shove looked small. The first insult sounded ordinary, and then it snapped. Gunfire ripped across the lot so fast that witnesses couldn't tell who shot first. People dropped behind motorcycles, crawled under tables, and clutched pistols with shaking hands. 9 men died. More than 20 were wounded. Brass casings covered the ground like spilled gravel, and the air tasted like burned powder and panic. Police swarmed in, and the public story became chaos. But inside the culture, the deeper story was control. The Bandidos had always treated Texas as home base, the place their identity anchored. The Cossacks weren't outsiders invading from another state. They were Texans too, and that made the defiance personal. A rival from the same soil doesn't just threaten territory, it threatens the myth that only one set of colors can rule the Lone Star State. After Waco, the crackdown was immediate. More than 170 bikers were rounded up, photographed, processed, and turned into headlines. To law enforcement, it looked like a chance to smash 2 violent networks at once. To the clubs, it felt like the state picking a side, because arrests don't erase grudges, they sharpen them. The real aftermath didn't happen on camera. It happened in the months and years that followed, when clubhouses tightened security, when smaller crews chose allies, when men stopped riding alone. Rumors of revenge floated through Texas, bars like cigarette smoke. Bikes were watched, homes were checked twice. Names were said carefully. The message lingered in the silence. Question the kingdom, and you inherit the funeral. In the world, respect is currency, and debts get collected violently. Waco didn't end a feud. It exposed the price of breaking protocol, and it proved that in Jeff Pike's Texas, peace was never peace. It was only the pause before the next engine roared. Ruben Doc Cavazos and the Pacific Line, when the Mongols refused to kneel. Ruben Doc Cavazos built the Mongols with a memory of exclusion and a taste for defiance. Founded by Vietnam veterans who were turned away from other clubs, the Mongols learned early that respect was never given. It was taken. That lesson followed them across California deserts and city streets, shaping a culture that never bowed to outside authority. So when the Bandidos began drifting west, carrying their Texas-born confidence toward the Pacific, Cavazos' legacy hovered over every encounter like a warning flare. The West had its own rules. California, Arizona, and Nevada weren't empty highways waiting for conquest. They were already mapped by bloodlines, alliances, and grudges that stretched back decades. The Mongols had survived wars with bigger enemies before, most notably the Hells Angels, and they emerged hardened by that conflict. To them, the bandidos weren't kings arriving to claim land. They were challengers stepping onto ground that had already been defended. The tension didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly. Biker bars suddenly felt watched. Support clubs were pressured to choose sides. Bikes were followed a little too closely on desert highways. Then came the violence that never made the front page, but circulated through law enforcement briefings and biker rumor mills. Drive-by shootings outside club-friendly spots. Bikes were torched in parking lots overnight. Men beaten badly enough to send a message without creating a martyr. Las Vegas changed the tone of everything. In 2002, violence between the Mongols and the Hells Angels spilled into public view at a casino, proving that the Mongols weren't afraid to bring war into places meant for tourists and cameras. The bandidos paid attention. That incident wasn't their fight, but it was a signal. Any westward expansion would meet a club willing to go loud, fast, and public if pushed. As Bandidos chapters pressed closer, the Mongols responded through pressure instead of parades. Smaller clubs were warned. Affiliates were flipped or punished. In Arizona and Nevada, law enforcement intercepted communications that hinted at meetings that were really ambushes, peace talks that ended with broken bones and stripped vests. In one widely discussed case, a Bandido support club member was found shot and left near his burned motorcycle, his colors taken as a trophy. The Mongols called it justice. The Bandidos called it a line crossed. What frustrated the Bandidos most was structure. Their hierarchy depended on leadership, ranks, and chains of command. The Mongols didn't move that way. They operated like cells, each chapter loyal but not dependent, making decapitation impossible. Arrest one leader and nothing stopped. Shut down one clubhouse and another surfaced somewhere else. It was a strategy born from survival, and it worked. By the late 20s, federal agencies described the rivalry as contained but volatile. No declared war, no treaties, just a constant hum of readiness. Both sides adjusted tactics, favoring infiltration, financial pressure, and proxy conflicts over open gunfights. Violence didn't disappear. It went quieter, more surgical, harder to trace. Underneath it all was identity. The Bandidos saw themselves as empire builders, spreading a code from Texas outward. The Mongols saw themselves as guardians of independence, allergic to anyone claiming dominance over their land. In the chrome reflections of their bikes, each side saw the same thing staring back: pride, defiance, and the certainty that riding second was never an option. Frank Hannebuth's European line. When the Hells Angels turned the continent into a war zone, Frank Hannebuth understood Europe the way generals understand terrain. As the public face of the Hells Angels in Germany, he didn't just oversee chapters. He managed balance. Borders mattered, cities mattered, and reputation mattered most of all. So when the Bandidos crossed the Atlantic in the late 1980 seconds, they didn't arrive as guests. They arrived as a challenge to an order that had already been enforced with fear. At first, it looked like expansion without blood. A new chapter here, a new clubhouse there. But in Scandinavia, the Hells Angels were already deeply rooted, especially around Copenhagen. Their influence wasn't loud, it was assumed. That's why the Bandidos opening a chapter in Helsingør felt less like competition and more like an invasion. The message was clear. Texas colors were claiming European asphalt. The war reached a point of no return in 1996. A rocket-propelled grenade was fired into a Hells Angels clubhouse near Copenhagen Airport. The blast killed a young woman who had nothing to do with either club and injured several others. That single moment changed everything. It pulled governments into a conflict they could no longer ignore. Special anti-biker units were formed almost overnight. Surveillance increased. Raids became routine. Behind the scenes, the conflict was about hierarchy. The Hells Angels viewed Europe as theirs, earned through decades of intimidation and control. Frank Hannebuth's approach was calculated. He didn't need constant explosions. He needed pressure, strategic alliances with smaller clubs, quiet warnings delivered through intermediaries. The Bandidos responded with their own structure, enforcing discipline and loyalty across borders. The result was a chess match, played with bullets instead of pieces. Each side testing limits, probing weaknesses, waiting for mistakes. By 1997, exhaustion set in. Police pressure intensified, and behind closed doors, negotiations began. The Great Nordic Biker War officially ended on paper. But paper doesn't erase memory. The hatred didn't disappear. It went underground. Turf disputes shifted into drug routes. Recruitment battles replaced public shootouts. Silence became the new battlefield. Even decades later, the scars remain. In Germany and Denmark, a single sighting of Bandido colors can still trigger police alerts. Clubhouses are monitored, movements tracked. The legacy of that war reshaped European outlaw culture. It proved these clubs weren't loose gangs. They were organized, strategic, and willing to escalate beyond imagination. For the Bandidos, surviving Europe was a badge of honor. For the Hells Angels, holding ground reinforced their myth. Frank Hanneboth didn't just defend territory. He defended a reputation built on fear. And in Europe, that reputation was paid for with blood, burned buildings, and a generation that learned one hard truth. Expansion always comes with resistance, and resistance always demands a price. Anthony "Snoddy" Spencer and the Australian Schism. When Brotherhood turned into execution, Anthony "Snoddy" Spencer didn't leave the Comancheros quietly. In the outlaw world, quiet exits don't exist. When Spencer broke from Jock Ross's iron control in the early 1980s, he didn't just walk away from a club, he detonated it. What followed would become one of the most violent chapters in biker history, and the moment the Bandidos transformed from an American outlaw club into a global force written in blood. The Comancheros were already powerful in Australia, feared and deeply entrenched. Ross ruled with discipline and punishment, and for some members, that rule crossed from order into suffocation. Spencer and a group of defectors believed the club had become a prison disguised as a brotherhood. They wanted autonomy, a voice, and power without submission. When they discovered the Bandidos in the United States, they found more than allies. They found an identity that promised rebellion with structure. Patching over to the Bandidos wasn't symbolic, it was an act of war. Overnight, former brothers became traitors. Colors that once rode together now marked targets. Tension built fast, especially in Sydney, where both clubs moved through the same streets and swap meets, daring each other to blink. No one did. The explosion came on Father's Day, September 2, 1984, at a motorcycle swap meet in Milpera. Two groups arrived, knowing exactly who the other was. Witnesses described the air as electric, a silence heavy with intent. A single shot broke it. Then everything collapsed into chaos. Gunfire echoed across the parking lot. Machetes swung. Civilians ran. When it ended, 6 bikers lay dead. So did 14-year-old Leanne Walters, an innocent caught in a war she didn't belong to. Australia had never seen violence like it. The Milpera massacre shattered the illusion that biker conflicts were fringe disputes. It forced lawmakers, police, and the public to confront the reality of organized outlaw warfare. The Bandidos were no longer just an imported club. They were now tied forever to one of the country's darkest criminal moments. For the Bandidos, the massacre became a grim origin story. Blood had sealed their presence. They weren't guests in Australia anymore. They were entrenched. For the Comancheros, it was a wound that never healed. Retaliation followed in waves. Shootings, bombings, beatings in alleyways and club car parks. Even when leadership changed and generations passed, the hatred stayed alive, passed down like an inheritance. But suppression didn't end the war. It reshaped it. By the 1920 seconds, the conflict shifted into drugs, extortion, and shadow networks. The clubs adapted. They always do. Yet, beneath the new tactics, the old betrayal remained the core wound. The Comancheros saw Spencer's defection as treason. The Bandidos saw it as liberation bought at a terrible price. Milpera taught the outlaw world a permanent lesson. When loyalty breaks, it doesn't fade, it detonates. And once blood is spilled between brothers, there is no peace, only pauses between funerals. James Big Jim, Nolan, and the Midwest Mirror. When the outlaws stood their ground, James Big Jim, Nolan believed in old rules. The kind written before social media, before flashy headlines, before outlaw clubs became brands. To Nolan and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, respect wasn't negotiated, it was enforced. That mindset is what kept the Outlaws powerful across the Midwest and parts of the South long before the Bandidos ever thundered out of Texas. And it's exactly why their collision was inevitable. For decades, the two clubs existed in parallel. The Bandidos dominated Texas and the Southwest. The Outlaws controlled Illinois, Ohio, and large stretches of the Midwest. There was an unspoken understanding: you stay on your side, we stay on ours. But expansion changes everything. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Bandidos began pushing east, not loudly, but deliberately. A new hangout here, a support club is there. To the Outlaws, it looked like encroachment disguised as coincidence. The Bandidos answered in their own language. Retaliation wasn't theatrical, it was coordinated. In states like Louisiana and Mississippi, confrontations ended with emergency room visits and police reports that named no suspects. Law enforcement began noticing patterns: two clubs crossing paths, violence following, silence afterward. Both sides understood the code. Talk to the police, and you're finished. What made this rivalry especially dangerous was the similarity. Both clubs were structured, disciplined, and deeply rooted in tradition. Both believed in hierarchy, enforcement, and the idea that disrespect must be punished publicly enough to discourage imitation. No hotheads were driving this conflict, there were strategists. By the early 2000s, federal agencies stepped in. The ATF began tracking both clubs, focusing on weapons trafficking and organized retaliation. Intelligence reports showed how support clubs were used as buffers, absorbing risk while protecting core leadership. Bars and rallies became pressure points. A gathering wasn't just social, it was reconnaissance. One incident in Louisiana captured the nature of the feud. After an Outlaws-linked event, a nearby Bandido-friendly bar was riddled with gunfire late at night. No one was killed, but the message was unmistakable. 2 nights later, several Outlaws members were assaulted outside a diner by masked riders. No colors worn, no arrests made, balance restored, at least temporarily. Unlike Waco or Milpera, there was no single massacre to define this war. That was by design. Both clubs understood that public bloodshed invites unwanted attention. Instead, they waged a shadow conflict, one that bled slowly and quietly. Law enforcement called it restraint. Insiders called it discipline. Over time, an uneasy truce formed. Territories hardened. Boundaries were respected again, not out of friendship, but out of exhaustion and mutual capability. Neither side forgot. They simply waited. James Big Jim Nolan represented everything the Bandidos saw in themselves: a reflection. Another brotherhood built on loyalty, fear, and memory. And that's what made the Outlaws dangerous. They weren't chaos, they were ordered. And when two orders collide on the same road, one mistake is all it takes to turn silence back into gunfire. They thrived in places where law enforcement coverage thinned and rival clubs underestimated the terrain. The Bandidos, expanding with Texas confidence, saw opportunity. The Vagos saw an invasion. And unlike other rivals, the Vagos didn't rely on noise or numbers. They relied on precision. The early years of the conflict stayed mostly invisible. Men followed each other off highways. Support clubs were pressured quietly. Bikes disappeared. Safe houses were compromised. Law enforcement reports from the early 2000s described ambush-style assaults in rural counties, attacks designed to wound or humiliate rather than kill. The goal wasn't headlines, it was control. Everything changed in September 2011. A motorcycle rally at the Nugget Casino in Sparks, Nevada, turned into an execution. Jeffrey Pettigrew was shot and killed in the open, surrounded by other bikers and civilians. Investigators later tied the killing to rival club violence, naming Vagos and Bandidos associates in the fallout. The message hit hard across the outlaw world. If a leader like Pettigrew could be taken out in public, no one was untouchable. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Retaliation rippled across state lines. Clubhouses were fortified. Members stopped riding solo. In deserts outside Las Vegas and along the California-Nevada border, bodies began turning up in places meant to erase evidence. Bikes were found stripped and burned, cuts missing. A signature warning in biker culture that words weren't necessary. What made the Vagos conflict different was geography. The desert favors those who know it. The Vagos used isolation as a weapon, forcing confrontations far from cameras and witnesses. The Bandidos responded with structure, sending enforcers and trusted members to reclaim what they believed was theirs by right of expansion. It became a chess match, played under a sun that forgives nothing. Federal agencies scrambled to contain it. Multi-agency task forces raided homes, seized weapons, and intercepted communications, referencing retaliation raids and border enforcement. Despite the pressure, the violence didn't stop. It adapted. Shootings became rarer. Disappearances became more common. Silence replaced spectacle. For the Bandidos, Pettigrew's death marked a turning point. The West was no longer a future prize. It was an active war zone. For the Vagos, it was a rallying cry. Pettigrew became a martyr, his name invoked as justification for every strike that followed. Each side hardened its position, convinced the other wouldn't stop until one faded away. André Spider Desjardins and the Canadian betrayal, the night Brotherhood died. André Spider Desjardins knew what it felt like to be hunted. Long before the Bandidos ever reached Canada, Desjardins had survived a war that rewrote the country's criminal history. The Rock Machine had battled the Hells Angels across Quebec in the 1990s, leaving more than 100 dead. By the time the dust settled, the Rock Machine was shattered, its leaders imprisoned or killed, its members scattered and desperate. Survival required reinvention. That's when Texas answered. When the Bandidos welcomed Rock Machine survivors into their ranks in the early 2000s, it looked like salvation. New colors, new protection, a chance to stand upright again. Desjardins and others patched over, forming Bandidos Canada. On paper, it was a merger. In reality, it was a marriage built on suspicion. Old wounds don't heal just because patches change. From the beginning, tension simmered between Canadian chapters and American leadership. Money moved south. Orders came down that didn't fit local realities. Veterans who had fought for survival under Desjardins bristled at taking commands from men who hadn't bled in Quebec streets. Loyalty became conditional. Whispers of theft, betrayal, and disobedience circulated quietly, the most dangerous phase of any outlaw relationship. By 2005, fractures were impossible to hide. Chapters are split into factions. Some swore loyalty to Texas. Others stayed with Desjardins and local leadership. Meetings grew tense. Security tightened. Members arrived armed not just against rivals, but against each other. The warning signs were everywhere, and no one stopped it. The Shedden massacre sent shockwaves through the outlaw world. Canada woke up to headlines describing bikers murdered execution style by fellow members. For the Bandidos, the damage was catastrophic. Their entire Canadian presence collapsed overnight. Arrests followed. Trials dragged on. The brand that had promised unity now symbolized betrayal. For Desjardins and former Rock Machine loyalists, Shedden became proof of everything they feared. The Bandidos hadn't offered a partnership. They demanded obedience. In the aftermath, the Rock Machine name resurfaced, resurrected by men who felt burned by Texas leadership. Old flags were raised again, this time fueled by vengeance rather than ambition. Violence followed, though quieter than before. Drive-by shootings, arson attacks, intimidation campaigns aimed at reminding everyone that Canada wasn't finished fighting. Law enforcement labeled it a second biker war, smaller but colder, driven by memory rather than conquest. Trust had evaporated. Alliances meant nothing. For the Bandidos, Canada became a lesson written in blood. Expansion without cohesion invites collapse. Control without trust breeds rebellion. The Shedden massacre wasn't just a loss of territory. It was the death of an idea. That brotherhood alone could hold an empire together. In the frozen fields of Ontario, loyalty ended that night. and every outlaw who heard the story learned the same truth. The most dangerous enemy isn't always across the border. Sometimes he's standing beside you, wearing the same colors, waiting for the order to pull the trigger. Geoffrey Jethro Pettigrew and the Desert Line. When the Vagos turned the West into a graveyard, Geoffrey Jethro Pettigrew carried himself like a man who believed the desert listened. As president of the Vagos Motorcycle Club's San Jose chapter, he understood the West differently than outsiders ever could. The desert wasn't empty, it was controlled. Every highway exit, every casino parking lot, every remote stretch of asphalt had a history, and that history was defended with violence. When the Bandidos pushed west, they weren't entering neutral ground. They were riding straight into Pettigrew's domain. The Vagos had long been the dominant force across California, Nevada, and Arizona. Their green patches were warnings, not decoration. Aguilar became one of the most visible faces of that split. Known for his calm demeanor and willingness to confront authority, he represented everything the kinfolk claimed to stand for: independence, equality, freedom from what they called forced loyalty. The name kinfolk wasn't accidental, it was a provocation, a reminder that this new club was built by men who once shared rides, prison time, and secrets with the Bandidos. Tension exploded on July 30, 2017 in El Paso, Texas. At a bar called Mulligan's Chopped Hog, a Bandido and a kinfolk member crossed paths. Words turned into fists. Fists turned into gunfire. Aguilar shot and killed Juan Compa Martinez, a high-ranking Bandido. Security footage later showed it wasn't a random scuffle. It was a moment charged with history and hate. The killing sent shockwaves through Texas. For the Bandidos, it wasn't just murder, it was symbolic execution. A former brother killing a leader shattered any illusion of reconciliation. Within hours, both clubs went into lockdown. Law enforcement flooded the area. The ATF labeled the shooting part of a growing outlaw war, but insiders knew this wasn't a new feud. It was a family war finally going public. After El Paso, the roads changed. Bars canceled biker events. Clubhouses reinforced security. Members stopped riding alone. The kinfolk expanded quickly, recruiting disillusioned ex-Bandidos who felt betrayed by national leadership. Every new kinfolk patch was seen as an insult, a reminder that loyalty had failed. The Bandidos responded the only way they knew how: pressure, intimidation, retaliation. Cars were firebombed, homes vandalized, kinfolk members were beaten or disappeared without explanation. The violence stayed mostly out of sight, unfolding in alleys and parking lots where cameras didn't linger. Law enforcement cracked down, but arrests only hardened positions. Ronnie the King, Bruinsma, and the Silent Streets. When Satudara broke the Bandidos' code, Ronnie the King, Bruinsma never cared for tradition. Where most outlaw clubs wrapped themselves in decades of ritual and hierarchy, Bruinsma built Satudara like a street empire. Multicultural, ruthless, and fast, the club didn't ask for legitimacy. It took space and dared anyone to challenge it. That attitude became a problem when the Bandidos pushed deeper into Europe and discovered an enemy that didn't recognize their rules. Satudara rose out of the Netherlands in the early 2010s, pulling members from Indonesian, Surinamese, and Dutch street crews. Their loyalty wasn't built on old biker mythology. It was built on identity and survival. When the Bandidos began expanding from Germany toward Dutch border towns, they expected resistance from traditional rivals. What they didn't expect was a club that refused diplomacy entirely. The first confrontations felt chaotic. Bars were attacked without warning. Bikes were torched in daylight. Members were beaten so brutally that the message was unmistakable. This wasn't intimidation meant to negotiate territory. It was violence meant to erase presence. Police surveillance later showed convoys moving with military timing, striking and vanishing before patrols could react. Bruinsma's leadership style was unreadable to outsiders. No clear hierarchy, no obvious command chain. Arrest one figure and nothing changed. The Bandidos, used to structured warfare, struggled to apply pressure. Their usual tool, negotiation through intermediaries, targeted warnings, and controlled retaliation, failed. Satudara didn't respond to signals. They responded to the opportunity. By 2014, the conflict had spilled openly across the Netherlands and Germany. Shootouts erupted near clubhouses. Stabbings followed. Authorities raided properties linked to both clubs, uncovering assault rifles, grenades, and body armor. Dutch media compared the violence to cartel wars, only fought on motorcycles instead of armored trucks. The cultural clash ran deeper than territory. The bandidos represented order, hierarchy, and expansion. Satudara represented chaos, speed, and adaptation. Bruinsma mocked the bandidos as foreign occupiers clinging to outdated codes. The bandidos dismissed Satudara as undisciplined street thugs. Neither insult slowed the bloodshed. What unnerved law enforcement most was Satudara's flexibility. When pressure mounted, they scattered. Chapters dissolved and reappeared under new banners. Members melted back into neighborhoods that protected them. The bandidos, bound by structure and visibility, couldn't disappear the same way. Every raid weakened their position, while Satudara kept moving. Governments responded with bans. Logos were outlawed, clubhouses shut down. Membership itself became criminalized. On paper, the war ended. In reality, it went underground. Small-scale clashes continued. Quiet assaults, targeted intimidation. A war stripped of patches, but not intent. Henk the Hammer Kuipers and the Eastern Push, when No Surrender rewrote the rules. Henk the Hammer Kuipers didn't believe in waiting for his turn. While traditional outlaw clubs argued over hierarchy and permission, Kuipers built the No Surrender motorcycle club like wildfire. Fast, aggressive, and unapologetically modern, No Surrender exploded across Europe in the early 2010s, recruiting riders who were tired of bowing to older empires. For the bandidos, already bruised from wars with Satudara and the Hells Angels, Kuipers represented something far more dangerous than a rival. He represented a future that didn't respect the past. No Surrender began in the Netherlands, but it didn't stay there. Within a few years, chapters appeared across Germany, Belgium, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Their growth wasn't subtle. They recruited ex-bandidos, former Satudara members, and independents who rejected strict chains of command. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To the bandidos, it looked like mutiny spreading across borders. The first clashes were small but symbolic. Nightclub confrontations, fights at biker events, public insults exchanged on social media, something older clubs avoided. Kuipers understood the power of visibility. He didn't hide his defiance. He broadcast it. That alone broke an unwritten rule of outlaw culture, where wars are whispered, not posted. By 2015, violence followed the noise. In Dutch cities like Emmen and Groningen, shootouts erupted outside bars linked to both clubs. Bikes were torched. Members were beaten in broad daylight. Police later confirmed that many of these encounters were planned, with both sides arriving armed and ready. This wasn't a coincidence. It was provocation. As No Surrender pushed east, the rivalry traveled with them. In Germany, smaller motorcycle clubs were forced to choose sides. Those who didn't suffer consequences. Clubhouses were vandalized. Prospects disappeared. The bandidos tried applying pressure through traditional means, warnings, intermediaries, and territorial claims. No Surrender ignored all of it. But bans don't erase loyalty. They just drive it underground. In Poland and Eastern Europe, both clubs reinvented themselves through front organizations and renamed chapters. The feud continued without patches, fueled by memory and resentment. Quiet stabbings, targeted intimidation, unexplained arson, a war no one officially acknowledged, but everyone felt. For the bandidos, No Surrender was a generational threat, a club that rejected legacy, hierarchy, and permission. For Kuipers, the bandidos were relics, symbols of an old order slowing progress. Their conflict wasn't just about territory, it was about time, old world against new. In the end, neither side truly won, but the damage was done. No Surrender proved that outlaw power could grow without tradition, and the bandidos learned a hard lesson. You can't intimidate what doesn't fear history. Eric Stone Rodriguez and the Houston Schism. When home turf turned hostile, and Eric Stone Rodriguez didn't arrive from another state to challenge the Bandidos. He rose from inside their shadow. Houston had always been the beating heart of Bandido country, the place where red and gold meant authority without explanation. For decades, no rival seriously questioned that control. That's why the emergence of Brothers East Motorcycle Club, known on the streets as B Times East, felt less like competition and more like betrayal wrapped in ambition. Rodriguez became one of the most recognizable figures in that movement. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He organized. Brothers East formed around former prospects, disillusioned associates, and independent crews who felt suffocated by Bandido hierarchy. Their pitch was simple: freedom without permission, power without tribute. In a city long ruled by one party, that promise was explosive. The timing mattered. By the late 1922, the Bandidos were under heavy federal pressure. RICO cases had thinned leadership ranks. Surveillance was constant. For rivals, Houston looked vulnerable. Brothers East moved fast, recruiting aggressively and establishing a presence around bars, clubs, and narcotics routes the Bandidos had controlled for years. To the Bandidos, it wasn't expansion. It was an insurgency. The early clashes were subtle: tires slashed, threats delivered through intermediaries, vandalized club spaces. Each incident tested boundaries. When those warnings didn't slow Brothers East, violence escalated. By 2021, Houston saw a spike in shootings and stabbings tied to both groups. Masked bikers ambushed rivals outside strip malls and mechanic shops, disappearing before police arrived. To most residents, it looked like a random crime. To insiders, it was a war unfolding in plain sight. Federal authorities launched Operation Bloodlines to contain the fallout. What they uncovered painted a darker picture: encrypted messages, coordinated assaults, directives allegedly instructing members to smash on sight. The language was cold and deliberate. There would be no negotiation, no truce, just enforcement. For the Bandidos, Brothers East represented a dangerous evolution. They weren't bound by old biker mythology. They didn't care about national structures or permission from higher-ups. They were local, agile, and willing to absorb risk. Rodriguez understood that surviving against a giant meant staying unpredictable. Small cells, short movements, constant pressure. The Bandidos responded by reasserting dominance. Clubhouses were fortified. Convoys became routine. Members watched each other's backs in public. The message was unmistakable. Houston was still Bandido territory. Anyone challenging that claim would pay a price. Retaliation followed, but it stayed mostly out of the spotlight. Quiet beatings, disappearances, warnings delivered without signatures. By 2025, indictments landed. 14 Bandido members and associates were charged in connection with violent acts tied to the Brothers East conflict. Prosecutors described it as an organized campaign of retribution. Brothers East members were also targeted, their movement disrupted but not erased. Keith, Conan Richter, and the East Coast Line. When the Pagans met Texas Fire, Conan Richter didn't rise by accident. He rose because he understood fear better than loyalty. Under his leadership, the Pagans Motorcycle Club transformed from a regional East Coast powerhouse into one of the most disciplined and violent outlaw organizations in America. Their rule stretched across Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and deep into the Mid-Atlantic. For decades, that territory stayed untouched by Texas colors. Then the Bandidos began looking east. At first, the overlap was subtle. Support clubs switched allegiance. Independent riders started wearing red and gold at rallies where pagan dominance had once gone unquestioned. To Richter, this wasn't a coincidence. It was reconnaissance. The pagans had built their empire on strict territorial control, and Richter believed that hesitation invited invasion. He didn't issue threats publicly. He prepared. The Bandidos were coming off heavy federal pressure in Texas, rebuilding leadership and searching for fresh ground. The Appalachian Corridor offered everything they needed: drug routes, gun pipelines, small towns where intimidation worked faster than law enforcement. To the Bandidos, it was an opportunity. To the pagans, it was trespassing. The first documented clashes surfaced around 2018. At a rest stop along Interstate 81 in Virginia, a confrontation between pagan-linked riders and Bandido supporters escalated from shouting into gunfire. 2 men were wounded. No one cooperated. Investigators later tied the incident to disputes over meth distribution moving through the region. It wasn't random violence. It was a border test. Richter responded the way he always had, with structure. The pagans fortified clubhouses, restricted movement, and tightened internal discipline. Intelligence intercepted by federal agencies later described pagan communications, referencing hold lines and defensive rides. The language wasn't emotional, it was strategic. The East Coast would not surrender without a fight. The Bandidos answered through pressure rather than parades. Recruitment increased among disillusioned mid-Atlantic riders tired of pagan control. Proxy clubs absorbed risk, clashing with pagan affiliates in parking lots, bars, and rural highways. Each side denied involvement. Each side understood exactly what was happening. By 2020, violence spread into Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of Ohio. Vehicles were burned. Members assaulted. Warning symbols appeared on walls and clubhouses. Law enforcement described it as an invisible war, one fought through intimidation rather than massacres. Both clubs had learned from past conflicts. Public bloodshed brought heat. Quiet violence bought time. What made the Richter Bandido conflict especially volatile was parity. Unlike smaller rivals, the pagans didn't fear the Bandidos. They respected their capacity, but respect didn't equal submission. Richter had built an organization capable of absorbing losses without collapsing. Decentralized but disciplined. Violent but controlled. Michael Iron Mike Lee and the Great Plains Pressure when the Homietos tested Texas. Michael Iron Mike Lee didn't come from legacy clubs or old biker families. He came from the margins, where riders learned early that survival mattered more than tradition. When the Homietos Motorcycle Club began spreading across Oklahoma, Kansas, and parts of North Texas in the early 20s, Lee became one of its most visible organizers. To outsiders, the Homietos looked like another fast-growing outlaw crew. To the Bandidos, they looked like a spark landing in dry grass. The Homietos didn't follow the usual playbook. They recruited from prisons, rural towns, and independent riding crews that had never been fully absorbed into the old hierarchy. Their pitch was simple: no permission, no tribute, no bowing to distant leadership. In regions long treated as Bandido overflow territory, that message landed hard. Riders who felt ignored or exploited listened. At first, the Bandidos tolerated the Homietos. Compared to threats like the Mongols or the Kinfolk, they seemed small. That changed when Homietos chapters began taking over drug corridors and weapons routes that had quietly fed Bandido networks for years. The shift wasn't loud, it was effective. And effectiveness is what draws attention in the outlaw world. By 2019, tension was impossible to ignore. Bar fights in Oklahoma City and Tulsa followed a familiar pattern. Homietos riders in one corner, Bandido associates in the other. Words exchanged, chairs moved. Someone was always left bleeding. Police reports called them isolated incidents. Insiders called them probes. Lee's strategy focused on alliances. The Homietos didn't try to fight alone. They aligned with smaller clubs and splinter groups, some already hostile to the Bandidos. Federal agents later described it as an opposition network, a loose coalition designed to resist Texas dominance. To the Bandidos, it looked like rebellion spreading through the plains. Violence escalated in 2021. Outside a bar near Fort Worth, 2 bikers were shot and killed, one tied to the homies, the other a known Bandido associate. Retaliation followed quickly. Vehicles burned, homes vandalized, warnings delivered without names attached. The message traveled faster than any press release. Lines had been crossed. The Bandidos responded with pressure rather than spectacle. Enforcers moved north. Support clubs were activated. Riders were warned about wearing the wrong colors in the wrong places. The goal wasn't annihilation. It was containment. make the cost of expansion too high to justify the gain. Karl, Big Dog Lebsack, and the Pacific Shadow. Karl Big Dog Lebsack never chased territory the way other outlaw leaders did. He understood something most rivals ignored. You don't always win by being the loudest club on the road. Sometimes you win by being the one nobody sees coming. That philosophy defined the Gypsy Joker Motorcycle Club and turned them into one of the most unnerving enemies the Bandidos ever encountered along the Pacific coast. The Gypsy Jokers were smaller than the Bandidos, and they liked it that way. Based primarily in Washington and the Pacific Northwest, they avoided flashy expansion and public intimidation. Their power came from precision, secrecy, and an almost paranoid level of internal security. When the Bandidos began expanding westward, the Jokers didn't issue threats or challenge them openly. They watched. At first, the two clubs seemed destined to coexist. Different styles, different priorities. But the Pacific Northwest isn't neutral ground. It's a corridor, drug routes, weapons, pipelines, ports that matter. As Bandido chapters and affiliates started appearing closer to Joker territory, the tension shifted from passive to personal. The Jokers didn't ask permission, and they didn't tolerate intrusion. Unlike other rivalries, this one rarely erupted into public violence. That was deliberate. The Gypsy Jokers believed visibility was weakness. Instead, they used intimidation that left little evidence. Members were followed, meetings were compromised, support clubs were quietly warned. In one widely discussed case within law enforcement circles, a Bandido-linked rider was found beaten and left miles from his bike, his vest removed, his message delivered without witnesses. Lebsack's leadership style fed the fear. He discouraged impulsive action and demanded absolute loyalty. The Jokers operated more like a covert unit than a biker club. Cells within cells, limited communication, constant counter-surveillance. For the Bandidos, used to structured hierarchy and visible dominance, this was deeply frustrating. There was no head to cut off, no clubhouse to pressure, no public mistake to exploit. By the late 2000s, federal agencies began paying closer attention to the Gypsy Jokers, especially after uncovering evidence of planned violence against rivals and law enforcement. Investigations revealed how deeply insulated the club was. Even under pressure, information rarely leaked. That same insulation made them dangerous to anyone who crossed them. For the Bandidos, the Jokers represented a different kind of enemy. Not empire builders, not rebels, hunters. The conflict stayed mostly underground, but that didn't make it less real. In Washington and Oregon, smaller clubs felt the strain first. They were forced to choose sides or step away from biker life entirely. Neutrality wasn't tolerated. What truly unnerved Bandido leadership was unpredictability. With other rivals, escalation followed patterns. With the Jokers, nothing did. Weeks of silence could end in sudden retaliation. Then, silence again. The lack of rhythm kept everyone on edge. No one knew when the next move was coming or where. Stephen McCraw and the Unseen Front. When law enforcement became the most dangerous enemy, Stephen McCraw never wore colors. He didn't ride in formation or announce territory. But to the Bandidos, he represented something far more dangerous than any rival patch. As the public face of Texas law enforcement during some of the club's bloodiest years, McCraw symbolized a kind of enemy that couldn't be intimidated, negotiated with, or waited out. While biker wars flared and cooled, this one never stopped. After Waco, the landscape changed permanently. The Twin Peaks massacre forced Texas to confront outlaw motorcycle violence at a scale it couldn't ignore. Public pressure was immediate. Political patience evaporated. McCraw, then leading the Texas Department of Public Safety, stepped into a spotlight that most lawmen avoid. He didn't downplay what happened. He framed it as organized violence, not a bar fight gone wrong. That framing mattered. It shifted the narrative from isolated incidents to a systemic threat. For the Bandidos, that shift was dangerous. Rival clubs could be deterred with fear. Law enforcement couldn't. McCraw pushed for aggressive intelligence gathering, surveillance, and coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. The result wasn't one dramatic raid, it was constant pressure. Roads became watched, clubhouses became mapped, movements became predictable. The old advantage of anonymity began to erode. Bandidos members noticed it first in small ways. Traffic stops that felt targeted. Patrol cars are lingering near known hangouts, a sense that every ride was being logged somewhere. What made McCraw's approach effective was restraint. He didn't chase headlines with mass arrests unless the cases were airtight. He emphasized building long-term cases, waiting for patterns, and letting rivalries expose networks. Every feud, every retaliation created data. And data was something outlaw culture wasn't built to hide. The Bandidos understood this threat instinctively. Law enforcement wasn't bound by pride or patch wars. It didn't care who won a territory dispute. It cared about dismantling structures. Unlike biker rivals, McCraw's strategy didn't rely on dominance. It relied on patience. The same patience that had allowed the Bandidos to grow now worked against them. For many members, the psychological toll was heavier than open war. You can prepare for a rival. You can watch the door. You can ride armed. You can't see surveillance. You can't predict subpoenas. You can't retaliate against indictments. Every knock on the door carried possibility. Every phone call felt listened to. McCraw's public statements reinforced the message. Texas would not tolerate organized biker violence. This wasn't a turf dispute to be managed. It was a criminal enterprise to be dismantled. To the Bandidos, it felt like the state itself had declared a position. Neutrality was gone.
Members of the Finks bikie gang have unleashed vicious threats after an Adelaide court hearing. Their anger erupting as police pulled them over after the jailing.
How does a man wrapped in tattoos, power and loyalty end up alone behind concrete walls, unheard? Brent Recker chased freedom on two wheels, built empires out of fear, and promised he could outrun consequences. But every choice narrowed the road. Rival guns, prison doors, and a mind under siege closed in fast. This isn't just a bikie story. It's about control slipping, warnings ignored, and how a life built on strength can collapse silently before the final fall comes.
Surrounded by police, furious Fink Andrew Madurak lets fly at television crews.
Get his thing off your car! I'll deal with you, get off!
From footy fields to inked skin, the making of Brent Recker. Brent Recker's story did not begin in smoke-filled clubhouses or under flashing police lights. It began quietly in Victoria, where he was just another kid chasing footy, friendships, and a sense of belonging. Teachers knew him as restless, but not reckless. Friends remembered him as loyal, energetic, someone who wanted to stand out, but did not yet know how. After finishing school in Perth, that restlessness deepened. The structure of normal life failed to hold him, and the pull of something louder, darker, began to take shape. By his mid-teens, Brent's weekends stopped revolving around sport and started drifting toward tattoo parlors and bikie clubhouses. These places offered what footy never could: identity. Ink was not decoration to him, it was commitment. At 16, he marked his body with his first tattoo, flowers etched into his shoulder for his sisters Lauren and Caitlin. It was personal, emotional, and symbolic. That moment mattered because once Brent started wearing his story on his skin, he never stopped adding to it. The bikie world fed something inside him: the roar of engines, the rigid loyalty, the unspoken rules, and the respect taken rather than asked for. Brent was not content to simply hang around. He wanted to build something of his own, something with weight. Perth, at the time, was already dominated by established clubs, and stepping into that space was not just bold, but also provocative. Still, Brent pushed forward, convinced that confidence could outrun consequence. His move was calculated. Instead of forming a small local crew, Brent reached across the ocean. He contacted the Canadian chapter of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club, a group already known for its violent reputation and history of conflict. After back-and-forth discussions, permission was granted. That approval was more than administrative. It was a green light to bring an international outlaw brand into Australian territory. When authorities officially confirmed the Perth chapter, it sent a clear signal that the balance of power was being challenged. Established clubs saw it exactly that way. The Rebels Motorcycle Club did not welcome outsiders, especially not ones carrying foreign colors and ambition. Online threats escalated quickly, and words soon turned into action. Nightclub brawls, firebombed vehicles, and arson attacks followed. Each incident tightened the atmosphere, turning Perth's bikie scene into a pressure cooker. Police watched closely, knowing violence was no longer hypothetical. Inside the Rock Machine hierarchy, Brent rose fast. He served as sergeant-at-arms, a role that demanded enforcement, intimidation, and absolute loyalty. It suited him. He did not avoid confrontation, and that reputation spread. But with visibility came risk. During this period, his actions crossed from intimidation into criminal certainty. An extortion attempt involving a brutal ultimatum brought his momentum to a halt. When the victims went to the police, Brent's shield disappeared. Patching over, reinvention through the Finks Brotherhood. When Brent Recker walked out of prison, he did not return to Perth or attempt to rebuild the Rock Machine legacy he had helped ignite. That chapter was finished, burnt out by jail time, internal fractures, and too much attention from police. Instead, Brent went back to Melbourne, carrying grief, reputation, and an unresolved hunger for purpose. Prison had stripped him of momentum, but not ambition. If anything, it sharpened his belief that he could still command respect, just under different colors. That belief led him to the Finks Motorcycle Club, one of Australia's oldest and most insular outlaw clubs. Founded in Adelaide in 1969, the Finks were nothing like Rock Machine. Where Rock Machine thrived on open confrontation and notoriety, the Finks prized secrecy, discipline, and internal loyalty above all else. Their black and white colors were instantly recognizable, and their logo, Bung, the court jester from The Wizard of Id, carried a mocking defiance that outsiders often misunderstood. Patching over into the Finks was not a casual decision. Their membership process was notoriously strict, designed to filter out ego-driven riders and police attention magnets. Brent was both. Yet his experience, fearlessness, and ability to command loyalty worked in his favor. He understood hierarchy, knew how to manage men, and had already proven he would go to prison without naming names. That currency mattered more than a clean record ever could. By the time Brent officially wore Finks' colors, the club was under immense pressure. Years earlier, they had been targeted during Operation Avatar, a coordinated police effort aimed at dismantling outlaw motorcycle clubs across Australia. Raids, surveillance, and prosecutions had drained the club financially and psychologically. In 2015, that pressure peaked when police raided dozens of properties, arresting members on charges ranging from drug trafficking to weapons offenses and extortion. Legal fees mounted, chapters weakened, and the Finks' reputation in Melbourne suffered badly. Brent saw opportunity where others saw collapse. He believed image mattered as much as muscle. Internally, he pushed the idea that the Finks needed reinvention to survive, not through surrender, but through control. When the club redesigned its patch in 2014, giving Bung a more aggressive look, it was partly symbolic. The message was simple: the Finks were still here, still dangerous, but evolving. Brent aligned himself with that narrative, presenting as both enforcer and reformer. Enemies on all sides. Power, paranoia, and the price of visibility. By the time Brent Recker settled into his role at the top of the Finks, his life had become a constant balancing act between authority and exposure. Power brought status, but it also painted a target on his back. As national president, Brent was no longer just another rider blending into the pack. He was a symbol. To rivals, he represented encroachment. To the police, he was a pressure point. To some inside his own club, he was a gamble. Brent believed visibility could be managed. He gave interviews, framed bikie culture as misunderstood, and spoke openly about rights, freedom, and territory. To him, this was a strategy. If the public saw bikies as human rather than monsters, police pressure might ease. But that approach cut against decades of outlaw culture built on silence and intimidation. Every public statement risked backlash, and that backlash came fast. Rival clubs, especially the Rebels, never accepted his return to Victoria under Finks' colors. Old conflicts did not disappear with new patches. They evolved. Threats circulated quietly, passed through intermediaries, half-spoken but fully understood. Brent knew it. His family knew it. The fear did not stay at the clubhouse. It followed him home, into ordinary moments, into sleep. In the early hours of May 31, 2018, that fear became real. At 4:40 in the morning, while Brent, his wife Tess, and their 2 young sons slept, gunfire tore through their home. Bullets ripped through walls, punched into neighboring houses, and shattered any illusion of safety. Outside, his car was set ablaze. Flames lit the street as shots were fired from a passing vehicle. The attack was fast, coordinated, and deliberate. CCTV later showed the chaos in fragments. A car is igniting, a man running. A weapon was fired from the back seat as the vehicle fled. 10 minutes later, police found what they believed was the getaway car burning nearby. The message was unmistakable. This was not intimidation. It was an escalation. Brent's family had been brought into a war they never chose. Miraculously, no one inside the house was physically hurt. But survival came at a cost. From that night on, Brent lived in a state of permanent alert. He moved houses, scanned shadows, and reacted to every unfamiliar sound. His mother later said he was always looking over his shoulder, always listening, always afraid the next attack would succeed. His greatest fear was not for himself. It was for Tess and the children. Police charged a rebels enforcer with the attack, confirming what everyone already suspected. The threat was real, organized, and ongoing. For Brent, the line between leadership and endangerment blurred. Protecting his club now meant risking his family. Protecting his family meant abandoning the very world that defined him. There was no clean exit. The revenge that changed everything. One order, one night, no return. 3 months after the drive-by shooting, Brent Recker was no longer operating from a place of strategy or restraint. Fear had settled into his daily life, and anger simmered just beneath the surface. He believed enemies were everywhere, watching, waiting, spreading humiliation as much as violence. In that state of mind, one allegation was enough to push him over the edge and undo everything he claimed he was trying to rebuild. The trigger came through a phone call and a conversation that police were already listening to. A close female friend told Brent that private photos of her had been shared online without consent. She named a man she believed was responsible. To Brent, this was not just gossip or embarrassment. In his world, disrespect demanded a response. Silence meant weakness, and weakness invited attack. The idea that someone connected to him had been humiliated publicly struck at his authority. Unknown to Brent, covert listening devices were already in place as part of a wider drug trafficking investigation. Investigators recorded his conversation, capturing his anger, his certainty, and the way he spoke as someone used to giving instructions rather than suggestions. The words mattered. In organized crime cases, intent often matters more than action, and Brent's voice became evidence before the night even arrived. On September 9, 2018, a group of Fink's members tracked down the man Brent believed was responsible. Police officers were already nearby, monitoring movements, aware of rising tension. They had been instructed not to intervene. The risk was considered too high. What followed was brutal and fast. The victim was beaten with fists and a tire iron, an act meant to punish, intimidate, and send a message. It was not a warning. It was a statement. For Brent, this was meant to be control. Instead, it became the final thread, tying him back to the very violence he claimed to be leaving behind. When arrests followed, there was no surprise, only inevitability. Brent was taken into custody and placed inside Melbourne Assessment Prison. This time felt different. The media tone shifted. Sympathy vanished. The narrative changed from targeted leader under attack to violent figure, incapable of stepping away from his past. Initially, Brent was granted bail. Those close to him said something inside had finally started to break open. He spoke about getting out, about legitimacy, about addressing his mental health. He had begun the painful process of tattoo removal, a symbolic step away from the identity he had worn on his skin for decades. He found legitimate work. He talked about his children. For the first time, there were signs of someone preparing to walk away rather than double down. That hope did not last. The Office of Public Prosecutions appealed the bail decision, arguing Brent should never have been released. The Supreme Court agreed. In February 2019, his bail was revoked. He was sent back behind bars, and whatever fragile progress he had made collapsed overnight. To Brent, it felt like punishment for trying to change. Locked inside his own head. Prison, pressure, and a system that didn't listen.
In hospital after being shot during an attack on his home in a suburban street in Adelaide. Police are hunting several men who stormed the house last night. Officers say the property belongs to a man.
When Brent Recker returned to custody after his bail was revoked, the environment he entered was nothing like the one he had briefly escaped. The man who came back was not the same person who had once thrived on structure, hierarchy, and dominance. This time, he arrived fractured, exhausted, and already aware of what isolation could do to him. From the beginning, he told prison staff exactly that. He did not mask it, he did not posture. He warned them plainly that being alone was dangerous for him. Prison records later showed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Brent repeatedly expressed distress, agitation, and suicidal thoughts. He complained of boredom, frustration, and feeling trapped inside his own head. To people who knew him, this was not manipulation. It was a man losing his grip on control, the one thing that had always defined him. Inside prison, status meant nothing. Reputation could not protect him from his own thoughts. At Melbourne Assessment Prison, staff flagged concerns and moved him between observation levels, attempting to manage risk without fully removing him from the general system. It was a compromise approach, one that relied heavily on monitoring rather than treatment. Brent, however, needed stability and specialized care. Instead, his days became a cycle of waiting, uncertainty, and escalating anxiety. Each cancelled appointment, each denied request, added another layer of frustration. Eventually, authorities transferred him to Port Phillip Prison in May 2019, placing him in a specialist unit designed for inmates with significant mental health issues. For a brief period, there was hope that this move would help. The unit had more oversight, better trained staff, and fewer opportunities for isolation. Brent responded positively at first. Those around him noticed he was calmer, more communicative, less volatile. It was not recovery, but it was containment. That progress did not last. In November, he was moved again, this time back to Ravenhall Prison. On paper, Ravenhall was modern and well-resourced. In reality, according to whistleblowers and staff, it struggled with inexperience and inconsistency. Systems existed, but they were not always applied with the nuance required for inmates in fragile psychological states. For someone like Brent, that difference mattered. Back at Ravenhall, familiar patterns returned. He complained of being bored, unheard, and ignored. He became increasingly fixated on small issues, including a cancelled dental appointment. To staff, it may have seemed trivial. To Brent, it represented loss of agency. He reportedly told a guard, "Do we have to hurt ourselves to get what we want?" Later, he told a prison doctor that inmates had discussed harming themselves if their demands were not met. Whether that was desperation or protest mattered less than the clarity of the warning. Concerns grew that Brent was influencing other prisoners. Prison management decided it was best to move him to a different unit, separating him from those he might sway. When guards came to transfer him to the Forbes unit, Brent told them directly that he had no plans to harm himself. Despite his history, he was placed under hourly observation rather than constant supervision. A death foretold, the final hours no one stopped. By the time Brent Recker was moved toward the Forbes unit, the warning signs were no longer subtle. They were written across months of reports, conversations, and near misses. Staff knew his history. They knew about the earlier attempts. They knew about the volatility, the fixation, the constant push and pull between control and collapse. Yet decisions were still made as if risk could be managed by routine instead of reality. When guards arrived to transfer him, Brent did not resist physically. He spoke calmly. He told them he had no plans to harm himself. For a man who had spent his life projecting strength, this calm should have been read differently. Those closest to the situation later said it was not a reassurance. It was resignation. He had learned that honesty rarely changed outcomes, and he was tired of fighting a system that spoke in procedures rather than understanding. Hourly observation was signed off. In prison terms, that meant long stretches of time alone. For someone with Brent's documented mental state, it was a dangerous gap. Inside the cell, frustration turned inward. He covered the walls with toilet paper, not as decoration, but as a barrier. He wedged the mattress against the door, blocking entry, reclaiming control over the only space left to him. These were not random acts. They were deliberate, escalating signals. Guards noticed something was wrong when routine checks failed to bring a response. From a rear window, they saw a chair wedged inside the shower. That sight triggered urgency. Forced entry followed. When they reached him, Brent was already on the floor. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no shouted threats, no spectacle. Just silence. Attempts to revive him failed. In that moment, the long chain of decisions collapsed into a single irreversible outcome. News of his death spread quickly through bikie circles, prisons, and the media. Reactions were split. Some saw inevitability, others saw negligence. Those who had warned staff felt vindicated, not relieved. Whistleblowers later said the move never should have happened. Brent should have remained in a specialist unit, in a padded cell, with no hanging points, no electrical access, no isolation. Those options existed. They were simply not used. For his family, explanations offered little comfort. His mother spoke openly about what he had become and what he had lost. She remembered the boy with small ears and a big attitude, the son who loved riding more than anything, the man who could clear a street just by revving his bike. She also spoke about the fear that followed him everywhere near the end, the way he jumped at sounds, the way he never truly rested. A Victorian coroner opened an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Brent's death. The focus was not only on his final hours, but on the entire chain leading there. His mental health history, the risk assessments. The decision was made to move him out of specialist care, the reliance on observation instead of intervention. Each detail became part of a larger question. Was this preventable? Brent Recker's life had been shaped by choices, some reckless, some calculated, many driven by identity and loyalty. His death, however, was shaped by systems. Systems that saw warning signs and logged them, but failed to act with urgency. In the end, the man who once commanded rooms full of riders died alone, unheard in the place he had warned them about the most. Legacy in ruins, power, loyalty, and the cost of becoming a symbol. After Brent Recker's death, silence moved faster than truth. Inside bikie circles, words were chosen carefully. No one wanted to say too much, and no one wanted to say the wrong thing. Respect for the dead collided with fear of attention, and what remained was a quiet reckoning. Brent had lived as a symbol of power, reinvention, and defiance. In death, he became something else entirely, a warning. For years, Brent had built his identity around strength. Strength in loyalty, strength in fearlessness, strength in control. Those qualities elevated him quickly in outlaw culture, but they also narrowed his options. Once you become the man people expect to lead, intimidate, and never bend, stepping away feels like betrayal. Brent understood that. Even when he spoke about leaving the club and going legitimate, those words fought against years of reputation. Walking away is easy to imagine and almost impossible to survive. Among the Finks, reactions were conflicted. Some mourned him genuinely, remembering his commitment, his riding skill, and the way he defended members when pressure was high. Others quietly questioned the path he chose. They wondered whether visibility had brought too much heat, whether ambition had outweighed caution, and whether the club would now pay for a legacy that ended badly. In outlaw culture, loyalty does not erase consequences. Outside that world, public reaction was less forgiving. Headlines reduced Brent's life to labels: bikie boss, criminal, inmate. Complexity rarely survives media framing. His attempts at reform, his mental health struggles, and his efforts to leave behind violence were often overshadowed by his worst decisions. For many, his death was seen not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability. That perception hurt his family the most. His mother's grief cut through that noise. She did not defend his crimes, but she refused to let him be flattened into a stereotype. She spoke about a boy who loved his sisters, a young man drawn to speed and freedom, and a father terrified of failing his children. She spoke about nights when he couldn't sleep, about fear that never left him after the drive-by shooting, about how prison changed him in ways that never reversed. Her words reminded people that even men who live violently still feel pain deeply. Brent's death also reignited uncomfortable questions about prison mental health systems. Whistleblowers did not speak anonymously out of bitterness. They spoke because they had seen the same patterns repeat. Risk assessments acknowledged danger. Reports documented distress. Transfers happened anyway. Inmates with influence were moved for management reasons rather than care reasons. In that environment, prevention became secondary to order. For younger bikies watching from the outside, Brent's story carried weight. It showed how fast ambition could elevate someone and how quickly it could collapse. Power offered protection until it didn't. Loyalty protected you until it trapped you. Identity gave purpose until it became a cage. Brent had tried to reshape that identity late in life, but the momentum of his past moved faster than his plans. In the end, Brent Reker did not leave behind a clean legacy or a simple lesson. He left contradictions, a man who wanted control but lost it, a leader who preached reform but returned to violence, a father who feared for his family yet couldn't escape the world that endangered them. His story forces an uncomfortable truth. In outlaw culture, survival often depends less on strength and more on timing. Brent ran out of time. The illusion of control, how authority accelerated the collapse. Brent Reker spent most of his adult life believing control was something you could seize, hold, and shape through force of will. In the bikie world, authority is often confused with safety. The louder the engine, the heavier the patch, the more people step aside. For a long time, that illusion worked for Brent. But control, once challenged from too many directions at once, becomes fragile. And when it breaks fast. As national president, Brent was expected to manage pressure without showing strain. He carried negotiations, internal discipline, police attention, and rival hostility on his shoulders. Leadership demanded certainty, even when none existed. Any hesitation risked being interpreted as weakness, and weakness, in that world, invites removal. That expectation forced Brent into a permanent performance, one where fear could never be acknowledged and vulnerability could never surface. The drive-by shooting shattered that performance. From that moment, Brent's authority no longer felt protective, it felt provocative. He began to realize that power did not shield families, homes, or sleep. It only redirected violence. That realization created a conflict he never resolved. Stepping down meant admitting limits. Staying meant accepting risk. He chose to stay, but the cost followed him everywhere. Inside prison, the illusion of control disappeared completely. There were no colors, no hierarchy that mattered, no influence that could override institutional procedure. Brent's attempts to assert himself through requests, complaints, and demands were met with process rather than response. Each denial reinforced the same message: the rules no longer bent for him. For someone whose identity was built on command, that loss was psychologically devastating. His behavior in custody reflected that internal struggle. Blocking doors, covering walls, issuing ultimatums, and escalating language were not random acts of aggression. They were attempts to reclaim agency. In environments where autonomy is stripped away, even negative attention can feel like power. Brent was not seeking chaos for its own sake. He was trying to force acknowledgement in a system designed to minimize individual disruption. What made his situation more dangerous was how his history shaped staff perception. Brent was known as influential, assertive, and capable of mobilizing others. Those traits, once valuable to clubs, became liabilities in custody. Decisions about moving him between units were influenced by concerns over control, not care. Managing influence took priority over managing risk. In that calculation, mental health became secondary. This is where illusion turned fatal. The belief that Brent could manage himself, that observation was sufficient, and that warnings were exaggerated allowed critical time to pass without intervention. Systems rely on categorization. Once someone is labeled difficult rather than vulnerable, responses harden. Brent crossed that line early, and crossing back is rare. His final days showed how completely control had inverted. The man who once dictated terms now reacted to cancellations and delays with desperation. Small frustrations felt enormous because they symbolized powerlessness. When control disappears suddenly, the mind searches for any remaining lever. For Brent, that lever was the only thing prison could not take away. his own body. Brent Recker did not die because he lacked strength. He died because strength, as he understood it, had no place left to operate. Authority failed him when it mattered most. Influence became isolation. Control became confinement. The illusion that had carried him through years of violence and leadership could not survive a system that responded only to compliance. When that illusion collapsed, there was nothing left to hold him upright. A system under scrutiny. When warnings become paperwork. After Brent Recker's death, attention shifted from the man to the machinery around him. Questions that had lingered quietly were suddenly unavoidable. How does someone with repeated, documented warnings about self-harm move through multiple facilities without sustained intervention? How does a system designed to assess risk allow risk to accumulate until it becomes irreversible? The answers, as they often are, lived in process. On paper, Brent's file was thick with alerts. Notes referenced agitation, threats of self-harm, frustration with isolation, and prior attempts. Each entry acknowledged danger. Each response followed protocol. That distinction mattered. Protocol ensures consistency, but consistency can become rigidity when situations demand flexibility. In Brent's case, the system responded correctly in steps, but never decisively in outcome. Risk assessment tools are designed to categorize, not predict. They rely on observable behavior, recent incidents, and stated intent. Brent learned quickly how those boxes worked. When asked directly, he sometimes denied plans to harm himself. Those denials mattered more than the pattern behind them. Staff relied on the latest statement rather than the cumulative trajectory. In isolation, each decision made sense. Together, they formed a gap wide enough to fall through. Transfers between facilities exposed another weakness. Each move resets context. Information traveled, but urgency often did not. A specialist unit recognized his fragility and stabilized it temporarily. The decision to move him back into a general setting prioritized logistics and influence management over continuity of care. In systems built to manage populations, individual nuance is often the first casualty. Whistleblowers later described a culture stretched thin. Younger staff, high turnover, and competing priorities created an environment where red flags blended into background noise. Mental health support existed, but access depended on availability, timing, and perceived compliance. Brent's assertiveness worked against him. He was seen as demanding rather than distressed, disruptive rather than deteriorating. The moment that defined the failure came when hourly observation was deemed sufficient. Observation is not treatment, it is a pause, not a solution. For individuals with complex trauma, grief, and loss of identity, time alone can magnify harm. The decision assumed stability where none existed. It assumed compliance where history showed volatility. The coroner's investigation widened the lens. It examined not just the final hours, but the decision chain. Why specialist care ended, why warnings did not escalate, and why alternatives like padded cells were not used. These questions were not about blame alone. They were about pattern recognition. Brent's case was not unique. It was simply visible. For prison administrators, the challenge is constant. Balance safety, order, rights, and resources. Yet systems are judged by their edge cases, not their averages. When someone repeatedly says they are unsafe alone, the margin for error narrows to zero. In Brent's case, the margin was treated as flexible. The aftermath brought recommendations, reviews, and renewed focus on mental health pathways, but reforms often arrive after loss, not before. Families are left to absorb conclusions that feel clinical against personal grief. For Brent's mother, explanations could not replace presence. For his children, reports could not restore a father. Brent Recker's story became a case study not because of who he was, but because of where the system failed to adapt. It showed how warnings can become paperwork, how risk can be acknowledged without being reduced, and how prevention collapses when urgency is diffused across departments. The lesson is uncomfortable and simple. When someone tells you they are not safe, believing them must override procedure. The weight carried home, family, fear, and the cost beyond the club. Long before prison walls closed around Brent Recker, the cost of his life choices had already followed him home. Leadership did not end at the clubhouse door. It sat at the kitchen table, crept into bedrooms, and lingered in the quiet moments meant for rest. For Brent's family, danger was not abstract. It had names, sounds, and a memory that refused to fade after the bullets stopped flying. The night of the drive-by shooting, permanently altered the rhythm of their lives. Safety stopped being assumed and started being negotiated day by day. Brent became hypervigilant, reacting to small noises, scanning streets, and changing routines. What once looked like confidence hardened into suspicion. For his wife, living beside him meant sharing that fear without ever fully being able to remove it. For their children, it meant growing up inside tension they could not understand but could feel. Brent's greatest contradiction lived there. He justified his position in the bikie world as protection. Yet it was that very role that put his family at risk. The promise of control collapsed under reality. No amount of reputation could guarantee a quiet night. No authority could stop a bullet from choosing the wrong wall. That realization haunted him, and those closest to him saw it clearly. He was not reckless at home, he was terrified. His mother watched this transformation with pain and helplessness. She had already lost one son. Watching another unravel was unbearable. She spoke about how riding once brought Brent peace, how speed and movement calmed his mind. When that outlet was replaced by confinement and fear, the imbalance became obvious. She saw a man trying to protect everyone while slowly breaking himself apart. When Brent was imprisoned again, that distance did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of fear. Phone calls became lifelines. Missed calls became panic. Each update carried uncertainty. The system treated Brent as an inmate. His family saw him as a husband, a son, and a father slipping further away. Those two realities never aligned. After his death, the impact spread unevenly. Media coverage focused on the bikie boss. Public debate centered on prison systems. The family absorbed a quieter loss. There was no closure in reports or findings, only absence. Children who would grow up with memories shaped by fragments. A wife left to reconcile love with fear. A mother left with questions no process could answer. Brent's life had been lived loudly, but grief arrived silently. It settled into ordinary days, into birthdays, into moments where his presence should have been. For all the talk of power, influence, and legacy, what remained most visible was what was gone. The club moved on. Systems reviewed procedures. The family learned how to carry loss forward. This is the cost rarely accounted for in stories of outlaw culture. Beyond violence, beyond rivalry, beyond prison sentences, there are homes that never fully exhale again. Brent Recker's choices reshaped his world, but the deepest consequences were carried by people who never wore a patch, never sat at a clubhouse table, and never chose that life at all. Reputation versus reality, how the bikie myth broke down. In the outlaw world, reputation is currency. It is built slowly, defended aggressively, and rarely questioned out loud. Brent Recker understood that better than most. His rise depended on the belief that fearlessness equals strength, and that strength guarantees survival. For years, that equation worked. People stepped aside, rivals paid attention, members followed. But reputation has a flaw that only becomes visible under pressure. It cannot protect you from everything. The myth Brent lived inside promised control. Control over territory, over loyalty, over outcomes. It suggested that if you were feared enough, respected enough, the chaos would orbit you without touching what mattered. The drive-by shooting shattered that myth in seconds. Reputation did not stop bullets. It did not spare neighbors. It did not pause long enough to check who was inside the house. In that moment, the legend failed the man. Inside bikie culture, this contradiction is rarely addressed honestly. Strength is performative. Vulnerability is dangerous. Admitting fear risks eroding authority. Brent followed those rules faithfully, even as the cost mounted. He spoke publicly about rights and brotherhood, but privately lived with the knowledge that the lifestyle had placed his family directly in harm's way. That internal conflict was never resolved. It only deepened. Prison stripped reputation down to its limits. Outside, Brent's name carried weight. Inside, it carried paperwork. Influence became a management problem rather than an asset. His assertiveness, once interpreted as leadership, was reframed as defiance. The same traits that elevated him in one system undermined him in another. Reputation proved transferable only until the rules changed. This breakdown exposed a broader truth about outlaw mythology. The narrative celebrates loyalty but punishes exit. It praises strength but ignores fragility. It promises family while endangering families. For many inside that world, the myth survives because questioning it threatens identity itself. Brent reached the point where reality could no longer be ignored, but by then, the cost of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. Attempts to reframe himself came too late. Tattoo removal, legitimate work, and conversations about stepping back were real, but they collided with years of accumulated perception. Reputation moves more slowly than intention. To the system, he remained a risk. To rivals, he remained a target. To the club, he remained a symbol. There was no space left where he could simply be a man trying to change. After his death, the myth endured for others. Clubs continued, hierarchies adjusted. Stories were retold with emphasis on loyalty and silence. Yet beneath that continuity, cracks showed. Younger members watched closely. They saw how quickly status turned into isolation. They saw how mental health concerns were interpreted as weakness. They saw how power did not guarantee safety when systems, rivals, and time aligned against you. Brent Recker's story did not destroy the bikie myth, but it challenged it in ways that could not be easily dismissed. It showed that reputation can amplify risk as easily as it deters it. It showed that control is often conditional, borrowed, and temporary. Most of all, it showed that an identity built solely on strength leaves no room to fall without breaking. In the end, the myth survived, but the man did not. That imbalance is the quiet truth beneath the noise. For every legend that outlives its subject, there is a human cost rarely acknowledged. Brent lived by the rules of his world. What failed him was the belief that those rules would protect him forever. No clean exit. Why walking away was never simple. People often ask why Brent Recker didn't just leave. From the outside, the answer seems obvious. After prison, after the drive-by shooting, after the fear settled into his home, why not step away and choose safety over status? The truth is harsher. In the world Brent belonged to, there was no such thing as a clean exit. Leaving was not a decision. It was a negotiation with history, reputation, and people who did not accept resignation letters. Brent understood that better than anyone. His rise had been public, deliberate, and forceful. He had worn leadership openly, spoken to the media, and positioned himself as a figurehead. That visibility gave him authority, but it also meant every move he made was watched. When someone like that steps back, it is not seen as growth. It is seen as a vulnerability, and vulnerability invites challenge. Inside outlaw culture, loyalty is permanent, but membership is conditional. You can fall out of favor, be pushed aside, or be forced out, but choosing to leave disrupts hierarchy. It raises questions others would rather avoid. If one leader can walk away, what does that say about the structure holding everyone else in place? Brent knew that even expressing the desire to exit could be interpreted as betrayal. There was also the weight of unfinished business. Enemies do not disappear because intentions change. Rivals measure you by what you represent, not by what you promise to become. The drive-by shooting proved that past actions linger. Even if Brent had stripped every tattoo and cut every tie, there was no guarantee the violence would stop. Walking away did not mean walking free. It meant walking exposed. Prison complicated everything further. Institutions do not reward reinvention easily. To the system, Brent was a known quantity. His efforts to go legitimate were fragile and easily overturned by a single appeal. When his bail was revoked, the message was clear: past identity outweighs present intention. That realization crushed what little hope remained. Psychologically, leaving also meant confronting loss on multiple levels: loss of status, loss of identity, loss of the only structure that had ever truly made sense to him. For someone who had built his life around belonging to something larger than himself, isolation felt more dangerous than conflict. The club, for all its flaws, offered certainty. Leaving offered uncertainty without protection. There is a misconception that strength makes departure easier. In reality, strength hardens roles. The more you embody a symbol, the less room you have to change without resistance. Brent had become a symbol long before he wanted out. By the time he reached for something different, the image others held of him was heavier than his own will. Even his attempts to distance himself were misunderstood. Tattoo removal was read by some as a weakness. Legitimate work was seen as temporary. Conversations about leaving were met with skepticism. In worlds built on permanence, transformation is treated as a threat rather than a victory. When strength becomes silence, the cost of never admitting you're losing, Brent Recker was raised, shaped, and rewarded in environments where admitting struggle was dangerous. From the clubhouse to the prison wing, strength was measured by endurance, not honesty. You rode through pain, you absorbed pressure, you handled problems quietly or violently, but never vulnerably. Over time, that mindset became automatic. By the time Brent realized he was losing control internally, he no longer had the language to ask for help in a way the system could truly hear. This is where his story becomes less about bikies and more about men taught to survive by suppression. Brent did speak up. He told prison staff he was not safe alone. He warned them directly. But the way he communicated was shaped by a lifetime of authority and confrontation. His words came out as demands, ultimatums, and frustration. To the system, that sounded like manipulation. To Brent, it was desperation wearing the only armor he knew. In prison culture, vulnerability without submission is often misread. When someone asks for help while still asserting control, the request loses credibility. Brent could not switch off the posture that once kept him alive. He did not know how to ask gently. He only knew how to insist. That disconnect proved fatal. His warnings were logged, not felt. Silence filled the gaps where conversation should have lived. Mental health assessments happened, but they focused on behavior rather than meaning. Staff observed what Brent did, not why he did it. Blocking doors, covering walls, and escalating complaints were treated as disruptions rather than distress signals. The more he acted out, the less seriously his emotional collapse was taken. There is a cruel irony in how strength functioned at the end of his life. The traits that once made Brent formidable became barriers to care. His confidence masked fragility. His history overshadowed his present. His influence triggered management responses instead of therapeutic ones. He was seen as someone who needed controlling, not containing. This pattern reflects a broader failure in environments that deal with high-risk individuals. Systems are designed to respond to compliance, not complexity. People who break down quietly receive care. People who break down loudly are restrained. Brent broke down loudly because silence had never kept him safe before. In the final stretch, the silence that mattered most was not his. It was the silence between warnings and action, between assessment and intervention, between what was known and what was done. Strength, as Brent understood it, left no room for collapse. When collapse came anyway, there was no framework left to catch him. Brent Recker did not die because he refused help. He died because he could not ask for it in a language that systems respect, and because those systems could not translate urgency from someone they had already labeled difficult. His story exposes a truth many would rather avoid. When strength is the only acceptable emotion, suffering becomes invisible until it is irreversible. After the headlines fade, what? Brent Recker's story still demands. When the news cycle moved on, Brent Recker's name slipped from front pages into footnotes, but the questions his life raised never really went away. Stories like his tend to harden into cautionary tales, simplified until they feel distant and resolved. That reduction is comfortable. It allows institutions, communities, and audiences to believe the outcome was inevitable rather than constructed through a series of choices that could have gone differently. Brent's story resists that comfort. It demands attention precisely because it sits at the intersection of personal responsibility and systemic failure. He made violent choices. He led within a world built on intimidation. Those facts matter, but they do not erase the reality that he also signaled distress repeatedly, nor do they excuse the mechanisms that treated warning signs as administrative noise. The temptation after deaths like his is to assign ownership of blame and close the file. Criminal history becomes justification. Difficult behavior becomes an explanation. Yet prevention does not operate on moral judgment. It operates on risk, pattern, and response. Brent's case shows what happens when response lags behind recognition. For policymakers, his death underscores the danger of fragmented care. Mental health support cannot function effectively when continuity is disrupted by transfers and management decisions. Each move resets trust, context, and momentum. Stability matters more than facilities. Consistency matters more than checklists. Without them, even well-designed systems struggle. For correctional staff, his His story highlights the importance of interpretation. Not all warnings arrive politely. Some arrive wrapped in anger, frustration, and defiance. Systems trained to respond to compliance often miss urgency expressed through conflict. Bridging that gap requires training, resources, and a cultural shift that recognizes distress regardless of tone. For families, Brent's story echoes a familiar grief. Loss compounded by public judgment, privacy eroded by curiosity, and mourning complicated by headlines that flatten complexity. They are left carrying both the absence and the narrative, expected to reconcile love with accountability in silence. For those inside, outlaw culture, his life exposes the limits of myth. Strength did not protect him, loyalty did not save him, power did not translate across systems. The same identity that elevated him also narrowed his exit until there was none left. That contradiction is rarely spoken aloud, but it is quietly observed. Most importantly, Brent's story challenges how society thinks about prevention. Prevention is not prediction, it is a response. It is acting decisively when patterns converge, even when the individual involved is unpopular, difficult, or morally compromised. The measure of a system is not how it treats the easy cases, but how it responds when complexity is highest. Nothing about Brent Recker's life fits neatly into a single lesson. He was neither hero nor caricature. He was a man shaped by choices, environments, and expectations that rewarded strength while punishing vulnerability. His death did not just mark the end of a life, it exposed gaps that remain open. After the headlines fade, what remains is responsibility.
And the owner of the home is a member of the Finks Motorcycle Club. Officers investigating the crime say they're frustrated.
Responsibility to learn without simplifying, to improve without waiting for the next tragedy, to remember that warning signs are only useful if they lead to action. Brent Recker's story still demands that much. The road that ends here. Final reckoning of a bikie life. Brent Recker's life followed a road built on speed, loyalty, and confrontation. From the beginning, movement defined him. Riding was freedom, noise was power, and stillness felt like failure. That momentum carried him upward fast, but it also meant he never learned how to slow down safely. Every phase of his life demanded intensity, and when intensity became unsustainable, there was nothing beneath it to fall back on. The bikie world rewarded Brent early. It gave him structure when normal life felt empty, and recognition when anonymity felt suffocating. Clubs provided hierarchy, identity, and purpose, but they also demanded permanence. Once he stepped fully into that world, leaving it required more than desire. It required rewriting identity, reputation, and expectation all at once. That was never a fair fight. Leadership amplified everything. Success brought enemies. Visibility brought scrutiny. Loyalty brought obligation. Brent wore all of it publicly, believing strength could absorb consequence. For a time, it did, but pressure compounds. Rivalries do not fade. Systems do not forget. The weight grew heavier than his ability to carry it, even as he insisted he could. The drive-by shooting marked the moment illusion collided with reality. Violence crossed into his private world and refused to stay outside. From then on, fear followed him constantly. He adapted by becoming more alert, more guarded, more tense. What looked like vigilance was actually erosion. Safety never returned, only temporary pauses between threats. Prison stripped away the last illusion of control. There were no engines to outrun thoughts, no hierarchy to anchor identity. Authority became irrelevant. Influence became suspicion. In that environment, unresolved grief, fear, and loss surfaced without distraction. Brent tried to communicate distress using the only language he knew, but it was the wrong language for the place he was in. The system heard his words, but did not absorb their meaning. Risk was acknowledged but managed cautiously rather than urgently. Each transfer resets context. Each assessment diluted responsibility. By the time action was required, momentum had already carried events beyond recovery. The gap between knowing and doing became fatal. Brent's death was not the result of a single failure. It was the endpoint of accumulation. Accumulated pressure, accumulated loss, accumulated misinterpretation. Each step made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a path with no exit. That is how most tragedies occur, not suddenly, but gradually. His legacy resists simplification. He was not just a bikie boss, nor just a victim of the system. He was a man shaped by environments that prized toughness and punished vulnerability. He made choices that harmed others, and he also lived with consequences that outpaced his ability to adapt. Both truths exist simultaneously. For audiences watching from a distance, his story offers discomfort rather than closure. It challenges assumptions about strength, control, and accountability. It forces recognition that systems fail most visibly when dealing with people who do not fit neatly into categories of deserving or undeserving.